Villain Deku Kidnaps KYOKA. Now before starting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Tamura Shigaraki was the first person to step through Kurogiri's warp gate, ragged black shoes transitioning from the warm hardwood floor of their bar onto the cold, cracked concrete of UAS unexpected simulation joint. A crazed, red eye swept across the landscape, studying the various simulated disasters the place was known for. Shigaraki had seen a few pictures of the expansive structure their associate had provided from his various drones, but to see it in person, well, his cold black heart was certainly pumping blood faster than it had in quite some time. The time to kill All Might, so early into his career as a villain he might add, was finally at hand. Sensei was going to be so proud that in his first real fight against heroes, Shigaraki would emerge victorious. The grotesquely large form of Namu stepped through after Tamura, taking its rightful place behind and to the side of its master, ready to protect him from harm even as more and more of the various NPCs Shigaraki had acquired for this fight filed out of the warp gates. That cannon fodder would be good for weakening all the enemies he'd soon face, and if he got lucky, their AI may even take out a few of the lower-level bastards that dared call themselves future heroes. His manic grin only increased in size, the corners of his mouth peeking up from around his father's hand placed snugly across his face as Shigaraki heard the low buzzing of his associate's drone, tearing his gaze away from the scowl cast down at him from atop the large staircase ahead by Eraserhead, 13, and those students cowering behind the two. The villain felt an odd mix of trepidation and satisfaction by the Roomba-like device he found hovering behind his right side, taking its place opposite Namu. It was pretty much exactly as he'd previously described it, a bulky, Roomba-like shape that was about the size of a large book bag, with two propellers attached to the sides for speed and maneuverability. This particular drone had been modified specifically to assist the hand-covered villain and was armed with a high-powered taser and an advanced targeting system to immobilize any foes that got close to him so Shigaraki could disintegrate the stunned individual. The machine's chassis was rusty, covered in scratches, barbed wire, and messy welding marks, exposed copper wiring connecting the body of the drone to the propellers which appeared to be made from the rims of tires. What the propeller blade itself was cobbled together from, Shigaraki couldn't say. But that's what you got when working with the villain jury rig. His contraptions look like utter garbage, yet function far better than their appearances would suggest. Kurogiri had found the drone's creator, at the time a diminutive teen named Izuku, in a landfill masquerading itself as a beach disassembling any marginally functional technology he could get his pale hands upon. He was emotionally distraught about something, and normally Kurogiri would have just passed on by, but the villain heard something he knew would interest Shigaraki. The boy was muttering something about proving All Might wrong. The misty form of Kurogiri talking to a young teenager on the beach may have made for an unusual sight, but no one seemed to ever be around the area. Apparently, Izuku was a quirkless kid who wanted to be a hero, but was never believed in. He said even All Might told him he couldn't become a hero without a quirk, and promptly decided to make his own support gear so he could compete with individuals who did have powers. It took several days' worth of prodding, but when promised higher quality materials, the boy readily agreed to manufacture gear to support Shigaraki's cause, even though the green-haired, hero-loving boy didn't realize he was assisting villains. Kurogiri had no difficulty passing himself and Shigaraki off as vigilantes with dark quirks. Izuku didn't seem to care how dangerous someone's quirk was, nor its potential for evil. It was all cool to him. Sensei readily supplied the boy with higher quality materials at Kurogiri's request to see what he was capable of and wasn't disappointed with his analytical mind. Kurogiri, however, was exceptionally distraught after the boy turned his blender and the League's vacuum cleaner into a robot, but was successfully able to convince the teen not to touch anything else he wasn't given by the League in exchange, providing the child with private tutoring. Apparently, the teen was upset with the lackluster education his middle school was providing him with. Izuku could consistently be found at the bar soon after, surrounded by no less than 2 separate textbooks or laptops at a time, constantly jotting down an endless number of notes in those notepads he always carried about in his yellow bag. If he wasn't taking notes, he was building something at Tamura or Kurogiri's bidding. Kurogiri's requests mostly amounted to asking Izuku not to build something, however, since the number of household appliances the League owned seemed to mysteriously dwindle when Izuku was around. The gear he made always looked like utter garbage and was clearly cobbled together with duct tape, hope in Kurogiri's latest toaster oven. But they worked. They worked exceptionally well, despite oft having the appearance of a computer left out in the rain for 5 months. Sensei himself decided to sell anything Shigaraki didn't want off on the black market to secure some extra funds for the League. That was probably the least fun thing that had occurred in the past 10 months, learning to manage his own finances, which was made infinitely more difficult thanks to the inherently illegal nature of everything he did. Still, Sensei said it was important to be able to fend for yourself in the world, and Tamura readily agreed. In any case, the boy vastly expanded the league's influence in a few short months thanks to their new business of manufacturing illegal support equipment. Kurogiri would provide the child a notebook not unlike the ones the boy himself seemed to have an unhealthy habit of writing inside, its pages filled with notes and observations on a villain. He'd give the boy the simple task of assisting the individual, and without fail, he'd magically conjure up some sort of device or occasionally a highly detailed guide on how to properly utilize the individual's quirk, which was then sold to said individual for profit. The child didn't even get suspicious when any villains he had knowledge of were brought before him in notebook form, Kurogiri disguising the slip-up as a test designed to ensure the gadget maker didn't sell anything dangerous to actual criminals. Shigaraki's twisted smile was a poor reflection of the bright, sunny one emanating from the child's own face upon hearing the explanation, pleased he had passed. It was far too easy to manipulate a child that was unwilling to see the darkness lurking in society's shadows. The illusion of being vigilantes wouldn't last forever. He could tell Izuku had his suspicions, but he kept making gear for them even so. Shigaraki quietly suspected that the child knew they were villains, but was refusing to acknowledge such information himself, as if facing the truth would be some mortal sin. To be fair, it would be. If the child wanted to keep up his flimsy excuse of plausible deniability, Shigaraki didn't care. So long as the devices kept coming, the boy could keep living and believing whatever he wanted to. Kurogiri obviously had the teen tailed by contacts and hired thugs, but none of them reported him traveling anywhere except the apartment he lived in with his mother, school, and occasionally he went back to the beach he was found upon to scavenge for parts if Kurogiri couldn't requisition what he wanted in time. He didn't even mind when Shigaraki ranted about killing All Might. Izuku just politely listened and nodded occasionally. He'd often reiterate that he didn't care much for All Might but would never go so far as to outright express hatred. The teen never expanded much upon that notion, only cryptically mentioning All Might had crushed his dreams with careless words. Tamura would always leave the room shortly after that occurred, because he'd get a disgustingly bright smile upon his face and talk about how he'd become the world's first quirkless hero with his gadget. Said it was his new dream to pass the UA entrance exam and make All Might admit that he was wrong. Shigaraki developed his first plot to kill All Might armed with that information, asking Sensei if they could turn Izuku into a living bomb with the capability of getting close enough to All Might before detonating. He received a modicum of praise for his plan but was informed that while such quirks did exist and could be utilized to force the boy to explode, none of them would be strong enough to harm the so-called symbol of peace. So, while Shigaraki was forced to ditch Plana and create a secondary means of attack, the teen suddenly stopped showing up. Tamura would have gone to his apartment and slaughtered his mother as punishment for ditching the league. But when he arrived in the neighborhood, Izuku's face was plastered on every pole in the area upon a missing persons flyer. Sensei was able to quickly uncover the truth of what happened. Apparently, the Yakuza had gotten wind that they were being denied access to the new analytical powerhouse that small-time crooks were utilizing to go toe-to-toe with fish bigger than they were. That was purposely done, however. Sensei didn't want to give the Yakuza's current boss, Overhaul, any advantage whatsoever over Shigaraki's League of Villains. Tamura had etched several new scars into the flesh of his neck when Sensei declined his request to recapture the inventor. Apparently, his doctor had yet to construct any form of portable life support device to sustain himself with. For 2 months, Shigaraki and Kurogiri had hired thug after thug, paid off moles, and even tipped off the police on Yakuza operations in an attempt to draw out any information about the location of their personal equipment designer. But Overhaul didn't bite. Whatever he was forcing the teen to do, it was important, and he was unwilling to lose that advantage. Just when the Misty villain and the Decay quirk user were getting ready to cut their losses and throw in the proverbial towel, one of their informants called and said he found the kid. Apparently, Izuku looked worse for wear and was hauling some small child with a horn away from a Yakuza stronghold he somehow busted out of, which had been conveniently set on fire. Shigaraki didn't care about the girl and told the NPC in no uncertain terms to kill the kid and drag the teen back down to their base. Tamura's orders were the last thing the thug heard beyond a single gunshot. After he tried to separate Izuku from the mysterious child, the various news channels picked up by their television were watched intently in the following days by Tamura, Kurogiri, and even Sensei himself, all wondering what the teen was going to do. He hadn't gone to any hospital or the police. Sensei's informants had never reported any 2 individuals matching their descriptions anywhere in the city. The shadow Kurogiri had placed on the boy's mother never reported anything back either, only mentioning that she occasionally went to visit the empty coffin that had been buried in place of her son when the police informed her it was unlikely the boy was still alive. Tamura was already packed and ready to abandon the bar in favor of a new one, entirely expecting that the boy had or would shortly be selling the league out to some form of authority. Jiro himself believed that the boy finally died, as he found it unlikely he would be capable of escaping the Yakuza without mortally wounding himself. Sensei, however, was firmly allied with Tamura in the sense that he believed the boy to be alive. But unlike his future successor, Sensei believed the boy had suffered through something that finally broke down the remaining barriers keeping him from descending into villainy. They got their answer after a final month of silence. A small, rusted, spider-like robot no bigger than a drink coaster crawled into the league's bar one night. A USB stick taped to its back with the words from Izuku sharpied onto it. Despite Kurogiri's misgivings, Tamura had eagerly shoved it into a laptop and played the only video file on it. He still liked to watch the video occasionally. It was nice to see the once bright and nervous child reduced to a mere husk of his former self, now far colder. He was obviously malnourished in the video. His previously skinny and non-muscular form had transitioned into something just above a walking skeleton. A timestamp in the top right had confirmed that the teen recorded this shortly after his escape from the Yakuza. Why he waited so long after recording it to send the video in, the league didn't know. Oh, and the fact that Izuku was limply holding onto the remains of Overhaul's signature mask, which was now torn beyond repair and coated in dried blood, tipped Shigaraki off, too. Someone small was recording the footage if Shigaraki had to hazard a guess. Judging by the way the camera was peering upwards at him and from how it shook, it was probably being held by that child the former thug had mentioned. But even now, Shigaraki had never seen hide nor tail of the mysterious girl, and through the short communications he'd had with Izuku since then, he'd made no mention of her. Anyways, the video. Right. Izuku's weak and trembling form described how Overhaul's men kidnapped the teen on his way to school, and the subsequent imprisonment and beatings he was forced to endure until he agreed to assist Chisaki in his endeavors. He went on to describe some strange invention he'd been manufacturing. Something about bullets with the capability of erasing quirks, but Shigaraki barely paid attention to the video even when he watched it now. He only liked to stare into the boy's eyes. They were like his now, haunted. What was once bright green and vibrant seemed dull, glassy, and lifeless. The boy had clearly killed in his efforts to escape and broke down emotionally, just like Shigaraki had. He couldn't really remember the rest of the video and didn't particularly care to. He said a few things about All Might failing to save someone named Eri, and how Chisaki had several heroes on his payroll to ensure that his operation was never discovered, which explained why word of his stronghold never reached the league's nor the police's ears. Izuku didn't describe how he managed to kill the Yakuza boss, much to Shigaraki's dismay, but it was messy, judging by the remains of his signature mask. The 10-minute video finished with Izuku explaining his new terms of service to the league's members, detailing locations Kurogiri could drop off notebooks on villains seeking his equipment, and an additional list of locations where Izuku would leave behind any products he finished for them. For the first time in the league's history, Izuku demanded he receive payment for his services, and not only that, he expected his money in advance to be delivered with the notebooks. It was made quite clear that failure to comply with his demands would result in the teen going solo and selling his services to whomever requested it. The threat left unspoken was quite clear to the 3 league members. There was a reason the boy had never gone solo before. He had no idea what to do or how to make contacts within the criminal underworld. The way Izuku spoke made it clear he understood this and didn't care. Either the league could lose a cut of their profits in exchange for keeping Izuku's brilliant mind around, or he'd go off on his own, get himself caught, and sell out the league without a second thought. Kurogiri had rapidly warped anything remotely valuable away from Tamura, fully expecting half his bar to disintegrate within 5 minutes. Even Sensei was surprised by Shigaraki's reaction, something which pleased the man-child internally. Surprising Sensei. It was rare for that to occur. The fact of the matter was, Tamura wasn't angry. In fact, he laughed. For the longest time after he first saw the video, he simply sat in his bar stool and cackled madly, much to Kurogiri's obvious confusion and Sensei's silent puzzlement. How could Tamura be mad at such a turn of events, though? His favorite game had been stagnating for months, turned into fetch quests that led to dead ends with no real rewards as he searched for his missing party member. He was ready to decay the game disc into nothing. And then this wonderful new DLC became available for free. His once temporary party member turned into an essential NPC, acting as a shopkeeper of rare, valuable goods. He'd not experienced a mechanic like this before, and it was an exhilarating feeling. The league found one final demand attached to an armored fist that was left behind at one of Izuku's drop sites, a small slip of paper taped to the dilapidated-looking device. It simply requested that Izuku be allowed to participate in Shigaraki's eventual plot to attack All Might, and he'd lend his technical expertise in exchange for being allowed to accompany him. All of that history led Shigaraki to this moment in time. standing in the USJ with Kurogiri behind him, Namu off to his left, a ramshackle drone on his right, and last but not least, Izuku himself finally stepping through the portal, with 4 more similarly designed drones following the teen obediently as he stood next to Shigaraki's personal protection bot. He appeared livelier than he had in the video, nursing himself back up to some semblance of health. He was still a bit skinny, and seemed to wobble slightly on his feet, but likely bore a determined expression upon his face. He said likely because Izuku's face was largely obscured by the villain costume he had designed for himself, something fitting of the name he had chosen to go by. Jury rig. It was rather apt, as every one of his inventions looked like they were cobbled together in under 5 minutes, much like his costume did. It was a simple, generic green mechanic jumpsuit, its pockets filled with a variety of tools and small devices. He wore a dented gray miner's helmet upon his head, its central light sporting a large crack across the lens. A paint respirator he seemed to have acquired from a hardware shop that obscured most of his face, and a pair of clear, plastic safety glasses. Said glasses looked like the most unsafe pair of safety glasses in existence, thanks to the various strips of rusted metal, exposed wiring, and an entire D-cell battery hooked up to one of the arms of the eyewear with what appeared to be twist ties and bent paper clips. Shigaraki could see various numbers and what appeared to be words flashing by on the lenses of the eye protection, so he assumed the modification provided the teen with some form of a heads-up display. Damn, he wanted a pair now. He could really use a minimap that displayed the position of his enemies. The red shoes the teen always used to wear had been swapped for a pair of brown combat boots, and he had a pair of thin, black nylon gloves upon his hands that did very little to provide protection, but barely impeded his dexterity like a thicker pair of leather gloves would. The final piece of equipment Izuku wore, and really the only piece of equipment that didn't make him look like a low-wage laborer that got lost on the way to work, was the large radio-like device strapped onto his back with a satellite dish jutting out from the top, slowly spinning around behind Izuku's left shoulder. Shigaraki's best guess as to its purpose was to assist in controlling his various combat drones, but he didn't particularly care what its true purpose was. Izuku's radio had a few more pouches on its side and a red bag with a cross on it, the unmistakable sign of a medkit. Izuku wasn't the party's healer. In fact, Shigaraki had foregone healers entirely in favor of overwhelming offensive capability. But it was good to see some of his party brought health potions. Izuku would certainly need it after him and Kurogiri abandoned the problematic inventor and the rest of those NPCs inside the USJ upon killing All Might. Speaking of which, his fingers twitched, shooting up to his neck to scratch at that ever-present wriggling underneath his skin in an effort to acquire some relief from the discomfort. Where is he? The villain rasped, his eyes scanning back over his prey atop the staircase, searching for the larger-than-life figure of All Might. The sound of crinkling paper drew his attention back to Jury Rig, who had pulled out a crumbled yellow sheet from one of his various pockets. HRM, according to this schedule you acquired, it says that All Might should be here by now. But that's odd. It's barely 10 a.m. I can't imagine All Might would have wasted his hero time for today already. He frowned, adjusting the glasses sat upon his face as he attempted to discern any secrets the schedule may have held. The drones flittering around his diminutive form seemed to become unsettled, bumping into each other and jerking around angrily in the sky as if reflecting his agitated mental state. Shigaraki's eyes widened at the teen's proclamation, remembering what Izuku had shared to the League after his descent into true villainy. When All Might crushed my dreams, I saw something I wasn't supposed to. He's weak, far weaker than you can possibly imagine. The only reason he appears healthy at all is because of his quirk. He can somehow force his body to appear healthy with it. He's got a huge, nasty wound on his left side, just below his ribcage. Says he can't be a hero for much longer than 3 hours a day. Now, I think, if your Namu attacks that weak point of his, you may just be able to physically harm All Might. Of course, the main plan for today would be to allow Tamura to finish off All Might, as nothing could withstand the decay effect of his quirk. If Namu could just restrain him long enough for Shigaraki to get close, he'd slap a hand across the big man's face and end it all. Still, since he armed a few of the NPCs with the knowledge he'd gained, perhaps they'd have a chance of getting in a critical strike against All Might. If he were actually here. Arg, come on. We come all this way to fight the boss and he can't even be bothered to swig a potion and show up for his own level. That's just not fair, Tamura lamented, casting his one-eyed gaze downwards. Still, an evil grin came across his face. Guess we'll just have to kill some time while we wait for his mana to recharge. While Shigaraki couldn't see it, Kurogiri and Jury Rig both rolled their eyes at the man-child's comments. His constant video game references and puns got tiring after a while. Izuku snapped his fingers, drawing the attention of Shigaraki even as he walked away from the central plaza. Have Kurogiri warp me back to the plaza if you need backup or a replacement drone. I'll do my best to keep anyone in the mountain zone off of you. If I neutralize all the threats in the area, I'll move on to the next until I get your signal," he called back, two of his drones dropping down rusty hooks attached to similarly oxidized chains that he stepped onto, allowing the devices to lift up and ferry Izuku through the sky towards his destination at a fast pace. Shigaraki found himself scratching his neck all the harder, not just because the essential NPC barely seemed to pay him any attention, but because he said the word neutralize. That sentimental idiot still refused to kill anyone despite the fact that he himself had admitted to doing so after being pressed by Sensei. Said it wasn't right, and never again. A villain with morals. How insane. Shigaraki's hand shot down to his pocket even as Eraserhead jumped down into the plaza, smashing villains upside the head and flinging them about with his capture tool. His thumb rolled over the pen detonator he demanded Izuku hand to him before they arrived. The bomb it was connected to hooked up to his personal protection drone. Tamura wasn't an idiot. A villain who refused to kill, coming along on a mission to kill All Might. Those two things didn't add up. What his goal was, he wasn't sure. Even Sensei admitted himself puzzled by the quirkless teen's intention. His original indifference to All Might seemingly transitioned into true hatred. But he refused to ever go so far as to say he'd kill him, just that he wanted to crush his hopes like he crushed mine and Erie's. The best the League had gotten was an assurance that he'd not stop any attempts to kill the symbol of peace, even if he himself refused to participate. That brought Shigaraki to his current predicament. He'd been assured by Izuku that his personal drone would follow any order it was given to the best of its admittedly large capabilities, beyond being ordered to attack Izuku himself. Shigaraki still wanted that detonator as insurance, however, cause there was no way in hell he'd trust a flying tetanus delivery system created by someone who refused to fully participate in an attack to back him up. He was certain it'd fulfill its function until All Might showed up, but after that all bets were off. He'd keep it around until then and then blow it to Kingdom Come. The bot suddenly adjusted itself in the air, aiming the high-powered taser ahead of Shigaraki as he refocused his attention. Two barbs shot out from the device as Eraserhead lunged at the hand-covered villain, which unfortunately embedded themselves into the pro's capture tool. The barbs unable to reach his skin, the discharged electricity was rendered ineffective. A strip of the capture tool was thrown at Shigaraki as the hero advanced, seeking to land a decisive kick to the villain's throat. Right before Shigaraki could grab onto the weapon, Jury Riggs droned up in front of the fabric and took the blow itself, momentarily distracting the teacher. Not one to look a gift horse in the mouth, Tamura quickly reached out to grab the pro's shoe, succeeding in disintegrating the sole before an elbow was shoved into his face. Or would have been, had Shigaraki not succeeded in grabbing onto the limb, slowly turning it into ash as he taunted the hero. All Might needed to hurry. This cannon fodder wouldn't entertain him forever. Break off and head to the entrance. Stay far enough away not to be targeted, but keep close enough for your cameras to pick up whoever comes in. I need to know if the heroes get back up. As soon as the command was issued, one of Izuku's 4 drones broke off from formation and flew away to fulfill his bidding. Izuku had built that one specifically for reconnaissance, cobbling it together with a stolen news camera to provide him with fairly high-quality live footage of whatever he pointed it at. Sure, it looked kind of dumb having the skeletal remains of a gutted camera welded onto the drone's body with an antenna or 3 speared through the whole invention, but it got the job done. If Izuku learned one thing from All Might, it was function over form. He didn't have any advanced machinery to build his devices with, so nothing he made was going to look high quality. So long as it worked, and didn't fail in its task, it was plenty good. The HUD he rigged into his safety glasses quickly turned into a live camera feed from the drone flying above the action, out of range from any attackers. Or at least, he hoped it was out of range. Shigaraki was unable to provide Izuku with a list of the students who'd be participating in the USJ training today. If that was because he didn't care to acquire the information or was unable to, Izuku wasn't sure. He found himself regretting his decision to remain dead to the world after escaping Chisaki's clutches. It meant he couldn't even text Bakugo to bother his childhood bully for information. Not that he'd readily give up that kind of information, but if Izuku pestered him about it enough he'd probably end up spitting out the basics of several of his classmates' quirks. Of course, there was the possibility that Bakugo wasn't in Class 1A, but Izuku severely doubted that. Yeah, Bakugo was a loudmouthed bully that acted less heroic than the villainous Izuku did some days. But he was powerful. It made perfect sense for the explosive blonde to end up in UA's first hero class. Just as his drone had flown close enough towards the staircase to get a clear image of the students he'd soon be fighting, Kirigiri made his move. It was originally Shigaraki's plan to drop the entirety of the League's forces directly atop the class and let everyone fight to the death in the chaotic mosh pit that'd create. But Kirigiri himself vetoed the plan. Warping that close to the heroes may allow some of them to vault into his warp gate, either on purpose or by accident. Giving away the League's hideout wasn't something he was looking forward to. He'd stressed enough about Izuku potentially selling out the league already to lose his bar now to crazed students. Secondly, Eraserhead would be close enough that his quirk could affect Kurogiri, and the villain wasn't keen on being left powerless and alone in the USJ. He didn't think angry pros, students, and severed limbs caused by his quirk shutting off would make good company. The bartender's own plan was much better. He wanted to keep the students preoccupied as long as possible in their group while he warped their own forces around the USJ to divide and conquer. He'd separate All Might and the other teachers from the students, forcing them to split away in an effort to save their lives. The symbol of peace would undoubtedly send 13 and Eraserhead off to save the students and insist that he'd take on the leaders himself. Separated from any support, Kurogiri was confident that Namu, himself, and Shigaraki could easily end the symbol of peace once and for all. At least, that was the original plan. With All Might being a no-show, the bartender was forced to interrogate the students for answers, but they didn't appear to be in a very talkative mood. Izuku only noticed Kurogiri warping away the various students. But if his narrowed yellow eyes were any indication, it didn't seem like he'd acquired the answers he wanted. Izuku sighed, the sound being slightly muffled by his mask and the wind billowing past his face as he flew forward. It looked like they'd be sticking with Shigaraki's improvised plan. Waiting. Truly, that man was a criminal mastermind. Izuku could have radioed out of the facility and demanded All Might march himself over to the USJ alone, but no. Total radio silence was necessary, forcing Izuku to use his tech to jam any and all frequencies in the surrounding area, in addition to killing the facility's alarm systems. If All Might wasn't showing up, why wouldn't you call for backup and demand he show? Izuku didn't understand. Sure, more pros may have come with him, but he felt threatening a few students would be enough to ensure they wouldn't interfere. Then again, Izuku was flittering about a soon-to-be battlefield with villains who didn't hold his twisted, hypocritical moral compass, so they'd probably readily slaughter the students the second they felt they'd be able to get away with it. Izuku winked, and the camera feed turned off as he focused his attention on the rapidly approaching mountain zone, where he felt the various rock formations would be the perfect hiding spot to set up ambushes with his drones. Plus, he could quickly jury-rig up some traps and tripwires around corners and crevices, turning the place into a veritable maze. He'd need every advantage he could get to fight the super-powered students. He only brought 2 drones that were suited for actual combat, and one of them was back in the plaza acting as Shigaraki's secondary bodyguard. His other combat drone flew behind his makeshift transportation system, ready to leap into action should its creator come across danger. It was much the same as Shigaraki's drone, covered in spiky, barbed wire for ramming into people, armed with a high-powered taser and a small shotgun that fired beanbag shells. That sounds kind of weak, but it'd easily shatter bone upon impact. Izuku would know. He'd been shot with them during his time as Overhaul's prisoner. The third drone he'd brought along was strictly for reconnaissance, and he'd already sent that towards the entrance to alert him when backup of any sort arrived. His remaining 2 transportation drones could be used for combat in a pinch, but they were mostly Izuku's GTFO plan. He held no illusions regarding how Shigaraki felt about him nowadays. He remained peacefully oblivious before Overhaul opened his eyes to the realities of this world. But now he understood exactly what kind of person Tamura was. Insane, psychopathic, and ready to murder at a moment's notice. He'd always given off that vibe to Izuku, even before he accepted it, but he'd succeeded in convincing himself that the obvious villain wasn't all that bad. After all, he wanted to make All Might eat his own words too, and he gave Izuku pretty much anything he wanted. In the past, Izuku bent to his every whim to curry favor, but now Izuku just kept himself marginally useful and forced Shigaraki to restrain himself from doing anything rash. The League was his only source of reliable income, so he couldn't just get out of Dodge and set up shop somewhere else. He spent most of his income on specialty parts for his inventions, at a premium price of course, since he was having them illegally shipped from questionable dealers who didn't record their purchases. The rest of his money was spent on taking care of Eri and himself to the best of his ability, but he was happy to say he'd been doing that fairly well, or at least, he thought he was doing a good job. She smiled whenever Izuku was around. That was something she'd never done back when they were held prisoner, and she really didn't like it when Izuku had to leave her alone for any length of time. To recap, he bought her toys, the pair were well fed, and she seemed happy. Oh, and she kept referring to him as her father now, so that was something. It at least meant that she was happy to be around him, he figured. Oh, right, his escape drones. He felt it was a good bet to take that Shigaraki would ditch everybody he brought into the USJ if anything went south, and Izuku was certain this wouldn't turn out like Tamura wanted. He had added several tanks of chemicals into one of his transport drones, with the purpose of turning it into a portable smokescreen generator. His secondary transport drone was equipped with a laser cutter of Izuku's own design, which he'd utilize to cut through the USJ's dome and fly away once Shigaraki's plans collapsed upon themselves. Yeah, All Might was severely weakened. Izuku had seen it himself on the rooftop the same day that Sludge Villain had attacked him, but he was still the symbol of peace. He didn't keep that title by half-assing things and not pushing himself at every opportunity. Izuku's goals for today were far simpler and more easily attainable than Shigaraki's ambitions. He'd wait for Shigaraki to run away after smacking All Might around for a while, then swoop in, smash a drone or two into All Might's side. Do that gloating thing villains seem to love doing so he could finally figure out what was so great about monologuing to your enemies, and then humiliate the symbol of peace. He knew just how to do it. He'd grab one of these students and keep them around for a bit as a hostage and would only release them after All Might gave a live television interview admitting that a quirkless villain had been his undoing. If he was hesitant, well, a beanbag shotgun blast to All Might's weak point would get the point across, he felt. Of course, he wouldn't be doing that in person. He built speakers into all his drones for the express purpose of communicating with allies even when he wasn't near the area. Izuku had his daughter to care for now. The bond the pair created while imprisoned by the Yakuza was forged in blood, quite literally, and Izuku made a promise to the small girl. Unlike his promise to Bakugo that the pair would become great heroes when they grew up, he intended to keep this one. No one would ever take Izuku away from her, nor would he allow anyone to take Eri away from himself. Shigaraki's rescue party found that out the hard way the second he said he was going to kill the kid and take him back to the League. That was the second reason he wanted to be in the mountain zone. It was pointed in the opposite direction of UA, giving him a clear escape route. He'd fly to the trash heap that was Dagaba Beach, hide his gear in a shopping cart, cover it up and then casually meander his way down towards the abandoned warehouse that served as his and Eri's home. She'd probably demand he cook katsudon when he got back since he'd be gone nearly all day today, ensuring he'd be the recipient of a pouty face upon his return. Izuku figured he could live with that. Just as Izuku's drones began their descent onto the rocky landscape of the mountain zone to let their creator off, Kirigiri's warp gate appeared out of the thin air, depositing two girls down in his landing space. "Relocate," he shouted, drawing the dazed pair's eyes to follow Izuku as his drone's propellers roared back to life, providing more lift and ferrying him a safe distance away. Several smaller warp gates had begun to open up all around Izuku, and his villainous allies began to shuffle out, searching for their quarry. "The targets are two girls," he shouted out, one of his drones automatically picking up and amplifying his voice across the mountainous region, drawing the gaze of his allies and enemies alike. "Both targets have black hair, one of average height, the other exceptionally tall. Tall girls in a skimpy red suit and the average one's got some kind of punk rock aesthetic." From his vantage point in the sky, he could practically see the outrage on the tall one's face at calling her outfit skimpy. But it was skimpy. He was just stating facts. Around him, the villains began murmuring amongst themselves and started nodding, fanning out and quickly zeroing in on the outed pair. The villains had gone through an exceptionally fast meet and greet, but it was unreasonable to assume they'd know who their targets instantly were, nor who all of their immediate allies were, and Izuku wanted to prevent infighting. The heroes in training appeared to be wearing their costumes and not any sort of identifying logos, so calling them out to his group seemed strategic. A flash of light and distant screaming drew his attention away from the battle about to begin before him, as he witnessed the flood zone spark and crackle with unrestrained electricity. Presumably, one of the students caused the massive discharge. It'd make sense for Class wanted to have all the powerhouses. Izuku made a mental note to avoid going anywhere near that area. His drones wouldn't be able to handle such high voltages. Turning his attention back to the battlefield, Izuku was met with the sight of a giant red boxing glove launching towards his face at high speed. His personal protection drone dove forward to block the blow but was too slow to stop the impact from occurring. Izuku's boots slid out of the rusty hooks he stood upon, and he promptly crashed against the cold, unforgiving ground about 5 feet beneath him. Thankfully, he hadn't been hovering high off the rocky surface. What kind of quirk shoots out boxing gloves?" he asked no one in particular, his head still spinning slightly from the impact. Still, he wore that helmet for a reason. Never want to bust your noggin open on a rock or anything. It was literally Izuku's only strength, his mind. His brain needed to be properly protected. His transportation drones immediately retracted their hooks, zooming down to float protectively around their creator as he gathered his bearings. His combat drone flew above the other two, shotgun and taser aiming at anyone who approached Izuku's incapacitated form. Wisely, the villains decided to give their downed comrade a wide berth until he got up of his own accord, pushing himself into a sitting position. Izuku was greeted by the sight of a well-proportioned heroine in training pulling a long, steel bow staff out of her abdomen, quickly assuming what he assumed to be a fairly competent defensive stance. She additionally conjured a machete out of her leg and tossed the blade to the punk rocker beside her. "Wait a second," There was an abandoned crossbow that had been unceremoniously dropped onto the ground near the scantily clad woman, and what appeared to be a boxing glove affixed to the front of an arrow. Searching the ground around him, Izuku quickly found an identical projectile nearby, no doubt the one that had smashed into his face. Alright, so the skimpy lady was going to be more of a problem than he thought. Whatever her quirk was, she was pulling useful items out of literal thin air, using her body as some sort of portal. Perhaps she had some sort of pocket dimension quirk that allowed her to store an unknown number of items within. If her pulling the weapons out of her skin was any indication, it appeared her skimpy costume may be slightly more practical than he'd originally figured, but only marginally. The punk rocker seemed to be holding her own pretty well as his villainous allies charged ahead in an attempt to kill them, in all honesty. Judging by the way some of the men around him were eagerly licking their lips like a kid in a candy store, however, perhaps going for the kill was a mercy. Izuku silently ordered his drones to target a few of the more lecherous-looking individuals, flagging them in their programming as potential enemies. He'd hold back for now, but he'd step in to save them if he felt things were about to take a turn for the worse. He'd continue to ignore the attempted murder right in front of him, though. Got to keep that cognitive dissonance out of his head. After all, being a villain with a moral compass was hard. Pushing himself up to his feet, Izuku backed away behind the ring of villains that surrounded the two students, the transport drones orbiting around his body in a protective circle while his combat drone continued to fly above his head, guns still at the ready. Feeling moderately safe with several meat shields and his drones in front of himself, Izuku toggled his HUD once more, jacking back into the signal broadcast from his camera drone. The lobby of the building was noticeably lacking the smoky form of Kurogiri at this point in time, and the few students that somehow avoided or were spared from his warp gates weren't making their way towards the exit. His eyes narrowed. Someone had probably already gotten out. But that was good, he considered. They'd call for the help Izuku wanted to radio for earlier, and All Might would show. Unfortunately, he understood the student would be arriving with far more than just All Might. That blue-eyed buffoon would have readily come alone if the League promised not to harm any students. But Shigaraki rejected Izuku's plan outright. Now, their time frame to attack the symbol of peace would be severely limited, if not gone completely. Of course, Izuku was assuming that All Might would show up at all. If his time was up, what hope would the hero have of fighting? He'd probably stay back and let those more capable deal with the crisis, even if it killed him to know he was useless. Maybe that wasn't so bad after all. To borrow mannerisms from Shigaraki, Izuku knew he'd not be passing go again. He'd need to land on a chance space and acquire himself a get-out-of-jail-free card soon. Wait, Shigaraki referenced video games, not board games. Whatever, Izuku would just stick to robot puns and pointing out the obvious. Those skills were about the extent of his bantering abilities. In any case, Izuku's camera feed picked up on a round-faced girl with a brown bob cut shakily tending to the still form of the rescue hero 13. He frowned a bit at that. Firstly at 13 who looked like they'd disintegrated themselves, which Izuku noted was a distinct possibility considering how Kurogiri's warp gates function. He was also upset with the girl tending to her wounds, which really just amounted to rubbing her suit's arms and shaking her around a little bit. Izuku did admit to being slightly puzzled at the situation before him. He couldn't see a body inside the suit, so he didn't blame the girl for not quite knowing what to do. Still, there was a far more obvious thing to do besides just rubbing her suit. Approach 13 and the girl but maintain a respectable distance. Open voice comms as well. He drawled, silently wishing he had a bit more time to prepare for this assault. Izuku had been working on a wrist-mounted keypad that he'd be able to use to control his various drones, but he didn't have enough time to debug the code before the attack. Unfortunately, that left him forced to use voice commands to control his armada, which, while not terrible, compelled Izuku to rely on his drone's AI more than he would have liked. If he had direct control, he'd be able to micromanage their movements with far more precision than he was currently working with. The brunette suddenly jerked her head up, tear-filled eyes staring down the drone with obvious fright, but with a fierce determination as well. Stay back. I'll protect 13, no matter what. Just like she protected us, the girl shouted, rising and getting into a shaky fighting position. Advance 2 feet, he ordered, the drone rapidly complying with the request. The fighting stance he observed the girl getting into was a standard one, likely derived from boxing. Arms raised, fists curled and protecting her face. Izuku didn't particularly care about any of that. All he knew was she wasn't pointing her palms at the drone or getting ready to fire anything out of her mouth. Whatever her quirk was, it was probably close range. I mean you no harm, I have simply come down to observe 13. He pleaded, hoping his voice sounded disarming. The glare he could feel even through the camera proved him wrong. Like I'd believe that. You villains came here to kill us. Oh, right. He did come for that, didn't he? Odd how easily he forgot he was a villain now. Well, he wasn't here for the killing, but he was definitely assisting with it. That's accessory to murder in a court of law? Yeah. Izuku shook his head and addressed the girl once more. Obviously, he'd not be able to get a closer look without risking his drone. See, that's a valid point, he stuttered, before wincing in pain as he felt his ribs crack, and the slap of a hand across his face. They were phantom pains, Izuku knew. The Yakuza lackeys decided Izuku's stuttering was annoying and sought to correct that behavior through negative reinforcement. Even now, just the act of stuttering made him recoil and flinch as he remembered the torture he'd been subjected to, shaking his head again to dispel the thoughts. He decided to just cut to the chase and get ready to make his escape. Look, 13's body isn't visible. All we can see is darkness inside that suit. You need to figure out some way of sealing that thing back up. It's probably the best first aid you'll be able to administer. Cut the comms and revert to previous instructions, his piece said. The drone backed up into the sky, repositioning itself high above the plaza and training its camera back on the USJ's entrance. He didn't have the chance to observe the girl's reaction, but hopefully she took his advice to heart. The rescue hero had saved countless people's lives with her quirk. To see her get snuffed out here, it'd be a shame. Boom. Izuku's train of thought was halted as his combat drone fired off a shotgun shell, the beanbag round colliding against the ribcage of one of the more lecherous individuals he'd marked as enemies earlier. Apparently, while he was distracted with the brunette and 13, one of them had advanced upon the girls and was getting ready to stab them with his knife-like fingertips. He'd have to fiddle with his eyes targeting priorities later. He didn't expect the machine to fire upon the villain when, all around Izuku, there were very few villains that remained standing, a majority of them apparently having been beat down by the two training heroines. In fact, the only ones who still remained were the ones he'd marked as potential threats. It seemed they'd decided to wait for the other villains to weaken the pair before making their move. The two students looked a bit worse for wear, tears across their clothes, various cuts, scrapes, and bruises adorning their body along their legs and arms, but it didn't look like any of the villains had ever gotten in a solid hit. That definitely wasn't good for Izuku. Not to mention, the few villains who still remained standing had directed their ire towards the drone user himself. I am missed, he offered with a shrug, doing his best to hide his trembling form. Thankfully, the mask Izuku wore hid most of his terrified expression from the heroes in training and villains, but he knew his eyes were probably as wide as saucers right now. You little GAH, one of the villains, a muscular man wearing a skull-like mask, pants, and a black ballistic vest shouted, before a bright red boxing glove was launched into the back of his head. The man growled and whirled around on the scantily clad woman holding the crossbow once more, electricity arcing across his fingertips. Before he could press any sort of attack against the two, the punk rocker's earlobes shot down towards her boots, plugged into something on the sides and released a truly impressive shockwave of pure sound, sending the villain flying backwards. The sonic attack reminded Izuku of Present Mike, the voice hero, and he made a mental note to jot down the young woman's quirk later when he got out of here. There were about 3 remaining adversaries in the area, but after taking a few glances at the largely unscathed woman and the drone-protected form of jury rig, they apparently decided to cut their losses and promptly bailed, jogging back down towards the plaza. Izuku thought he could hear the sound of a door being slammed open in the distance, and his glasses started automatically playing live footage broadcast from the camera bot. All Might had arrived. The sheer elation and happiness Izuku felt at the sight of his once idol coming to save the day was quickly crushed under the heel of his boot as he reminded himself that saving the day involved pounding himself into dust, unless he wanted to be on the receiving end of another Detroit smash. This time directed at his face rather than a villain holding him hostage. He'd need to be careful. Flipping off the news feed, Izuku directed his full attention towards the battlefield in front of him. Bodies littered the ground, and Izuku could tell by the oddly bent limbs of most of the downed villains. These girls were no pushovers. They weren't just flailing about their weapons with reckless abandon. They clearly knew how to use them, too. Still, he needed to attack them. Either Shigaraki was about to succeed in his mission, which was extremely unlikely, or he was about to beat a hasty retreat and abandon Izuku, with other pros no doubt on the way to assist All Might. He needed a hostage if he was going to get out of here and humiliate the symbol of peace. Right now, he sent one final command to the reconnaissance drone, ordering it to trail the hero so he could keep tabs on the unstoppable force of All Might colliding with the immovable object that was Namo. No one made a move, both parties unsure of how to proceed. For the girls, they found themselves in an awkward position. The guy with scalpels for fingers managed to sneak up behind Jiro and was just about to stab her when another villain they were fighting made his drone shoot his own ally. They'd been helped, but why? Was he secretly a hero, or maybe even a vigilante that had infiltrated the assault? Then again, this was the same guy Momo had to blast off his literal high horse because he was barking out tactical information to the villains about their appearances. And Momo was still clearly peeved at her outfit being called skimpy. despite the inherent truth in the villain's words. In either case, the girls were at a loss. They recognized that the time they could be spending attacking the villain was being wasted with their internal debating. But he made no moves to assault the pair. It seemed he was undergoing his own silent conundrum underneath that mining helmet. He was too far away for either of the girls to rush with their melee weapons. And Momo's crossbow was currently out of ammo. She wasn't sure if she should be making more with the potential villain in front of them. Even if she did make more, it'd take far too long to load it back into the crossbow before those hideous metal death traps that somehow managed to fly did something to stop her. It'd be fairly easy for Jiro to simply blast the foe away with her sonic attack, but she wasn't certain she could hit both him and all three of his drones in a single blast. No doubt those things would retaliate if he was harmed, unless he was mentally manipulating them with his quirk. If that was the case, knocking him unconscious was the best outcome right now. Before anything could happen, the scrap mechanic snapped his fingers, and those drones he was using to fly around with earlier dropped two rusty hooks down from their chassis. He stepped onto the metal and was soon hovering above the battlefield once more as he stared the pair of girls down. "I don't suppose we could convince you to surrender," Momo chimed, drawing a questioning glare from Jiro. Villains didn't surrender when they were backed into a corner. They struggled like wild animals. "Target the tall one." The pair of students took a step back at the declaration, noticing with slight apprehension the gun attached to one of his drones zeroed in on Yaoyorozu's form, ready to fire. Jiro subtly shifted her stance, trying to line up the speaker in her boot with the airborne form of the mechanic. Her footwear wasn't designed to attack aerial targets. They were designed to attack against whoever was directly in front of her. Hopefully, the recoil caused by her sonic attack wouldn't break her leg or anything. The cleats on the bottom of her boots assisted in absorbing the recoil her equipment caused. But now that her soul wasn't firmly planted into the ground. "Don't try anything, punk rock. I've go. BWOOM. Whatever the villain was about to say. He never got a chance to finish as Jiro did exactly what she planned to do, managing to capture both the villain and his three drones in her sonic assault. He immediately lost his footing on the hooks his boots stood upon and started falling back down to the ground. Unfortunately, his gloved hand succeeded in grabbing onto one of the rusted chains dangling off his invention's body before he hit the dirt, killing Jiro's plan of knocking him unconscious upon impact with the ground. He was still pushed respectably far away from the girls, the drones frantically rotating their propellers and wrenching about in the sky as they sought to correct their flight patterns. Also unfortunate was Jiro's leg. Her bones were most definitely snapped right above the ankle, her boots recoil kicking back with more force than either her tibia or fibula could handle. Momo cried out and bent down by the rocker's prone form, rapidly yanking a splint and a pair of heavy-duty cutters out of her abdomen. "KYOKA, I need to remove your boot to set the bone in place before we can get out of here." The punk rocker's face was twisted into an expression of pain, her calloused fingers clawing at the rocky terrain underneath them. She knew removing that boot wasn't going to feel good. Even so, she nodded wordlessly to her new friend, not quite trusting herself to speak at this moment in time. She failed to take the villain out of the picture, and as soon as his drones regained stability, she was certain they'd be coming back to finish them off. Their team had made the first move. Now it was time to prepare for the retaliatory strike. Momo had already started tearing through KYOKA's boot with her cutters, doing her very best not to jostle her broken leg. The flesh already looked discolored and was jetting outwards from the bone's awkward positions inside. But it hadn't pierced through her flesh. Just as she finally made a decent cut through the side of the footwear, the drones were back. More specifically, a single drone was back, the one armed with the shotgun. Momo and Jiro could see the villain controlling them hovering away in the distance, once more standing on the two rusted hooks that supported his weight. Clearly, he wasn't going to get involved directly in the fight this time. Momo kept flickering her gaze between the distant figure of the villain and the barbed wire-encased drone hovering a few feet in front of the pair of students. He wasn't pressing his attack, so he was waiting for something. But what? A crackling sound emanated from the body of the drone itself, like an old speaker being turned on after a long period of unuse. The unmistakable voice of their adversary poured out from the speakers, filled with static, yet still soft and firm. "I'm going to knock you out, Skimpy. That's simply a fact. However, I'll let you patch up your friend first if neither of you try anything heroic again." The speaker roared, doing very little to quell the fears inside either of the two. If Momo was incapacitated, the pair would be completely at the mercy of whatever the crazed mechanic had planned for them. Jiro wouldn't be able to fight that drone off with a single leg, and any attack she could land on it would probably result in another broken leg. "Your hesitance bores me. I have a schedule to keep. Fix your friend, and let's get on with it. I won't kill either of you, but I'm not going to stick around so All Might can smash me into dirt. Either you set your friend's leg in place, or I just drag her around the battlefield and let the bones tear up her flesh from the inside. Your call." Momo scowled at the drone but got back to work. Jiro winced as the boot was finally removed from her broken limb, but her mind couldn't focus much on the pain right now. He said he wasn't going to kill them, and while she didn't believe such an assertion, combining that with the threat of being dragged around the battlefield gave her a pretty good idea of what was about to happen. She was going to be used as a hostage. Momo had managed to slide the splint into place, securing it as best she could. Kyoka's other boot was similarly slipped off her foot and tossed aside, while Momo stood up and faced their mechanical enemy. Good. Will her leg be all right for now? It sputtered, a spark flying off of one of its propellers. She needs a hospital. Her bones are broken, the heiress scowled, glaring down at the Mad Max-esque Roomba. I have a medic back at my base. She'll be well taken care of. The drone shot back, and in the distance, Momo noticed one of his transportation bots had flown away from the villain, leaving him dangling off of a single rusted hook suspended from his robot. As it got closer, she noticed the exceptionally bulky chrome gauntlets hanging off of the hook as it zoomed forwards, the same kind of gauntlets used by police to neutralize the powers of captured villains. Quickly piecing together his intentions, Momo let out a low growl, standing protectively in front of her new friend. Before any retorts or threats could come from her mouth, however, the combat drone finally made its move, taser barbs embedding directly into the tall girl's chest. Her muscles locked up as she grimaced in pain for a few seconds, before the voltage cut out and she slumped to the ground out cold. Momo, Kyoka's jerk reaction to stand up and assist her friend was met with a surge of pain when she tried bending her ankle, forcing the girl to remain seated on the ground as the drone with the hook hovered ominously closer to her. Put these on and loop your arms over the hook. The drone can easily support your weight, so have no fear of falling. The device droned, the static-filled voice of the villain spewing out from his inventions. What should she do? Kyoka's eyes widened as the taser-armed bot swiveled in the air, its sights firmly set upon herself. She needed to think fast. Oh, only if you get Momo away from these villains, she shouted, more out of a knee-jerk reaction than any sort of thought-out plan. Still, if she was going to be taken hostage, she wasn't going to be leaving her friend alone with all of these criminals still around. That was just asking for trouble. Deal, the drone immediately proclaimed. Kyoka's eyes shrunk down to pinpricks. She didn't expect her demand to even be considered by the criminal, she just wanted to buy time. Her gaze shot across the battlefield, searching for anything she could use to even the odds or escape from her apparent fate. It seemed that nothing escaped the villain's observant eyes. However, seemingly fed up with her indecision, 2 more barbs rocketed out from the combat robot, embedding themselves into Kyoka's ribs. Much like Momo, her body seized up as the electricity coursed through her body, passing out as soon as the electricity was cut off. The single drone Izuku was utilizing to fly across the battlefield puttered its way over towards the downed forms of his 2 adversaries. The drone, unable to achieve the same speeds it had been capable of achieving earlier now that he wasn't using 2 of them to attain flight. A single drone could still easily support his weight, but it was far slower and less responsive than when he utilized 2. Setting himself down near the girls, Izuku hopped off his hook and pulled a pair of standard handcuffs from one of his many pockets, locking them onto the girl now identified as Momo's wrists. Looping the chain connecting the cuffs together across his rusty transportation hook, Izuku snapped his fingers and pointed the drone back towards the entrance. Its orders clear, the drone ferried Momo's unconscious body away from the fight, bending down to the unmoving punk rocker's level. Izuku got to work affixing the power suppressant cuffs across the girl's wrists. Much like Momo had been ferried away suspended by the cuffs on her wrists, this girl would soon share the same fate. Unlike Momo, however, this one would be taking a small vacation from school in his warehouse abode. Locked in a shipping crate he'd turned into a cell. This wasn't kidnapping. This was a non-consensual, mandatory vacation. Yeah, that sounded good. Satisfied that the bracers wouldn't be coming off of the rocker without Izuku's key, Izuku activated their maglocks, watching as the 2 bracers readily snapped together with surprising force. She definitely wouldn't be able to pull those apart. He tossed her hands over his remaining transportation drone's hook, and a small alert popped up upon his glasses. Izuku turned around and was greeted with the sight of his other transportation drone flying back towards him, its payload of Momo having been safely deposited near the entrance of the USJ. He would have stuck to his original plan of beating down All Might a bit and threatening him. But the sight of Shigaraki's Namu being launched through the air and out of the USJ was quite a sight to behold. The trepidation Izuku felt at Shigaraki's bioweapon being utterly defeated was slightly relieved by the large hole his body created in the USJ's dome, providing Izuku with the perfect exit. He wouldn't need to cut his way out of the USJ anymore. He'd just fly out of Namu's exit point. New exit point located. Reprioritize escape route, he said, pointing a gloved hand at the newly created hole, his drones quickly regrouping and preparing themselves to fly through it. As soon as his secondary transport drone got within range, Izuku leapt onto the rusted hook, jostling its flight pattern slightly as the device sought to correct its course. Even so, it diligently continued the upwards flight, followed closely by Izuku's combat drone and the rocker's own transport. Izuku wasn't receiving any signal from the drone he assigned to protect Shigaraki, but he didn't really expect to anyways. As soon as Tamura demanded an explosive be planted into his drone, and he received the detonator, he knew its warranty was expired. In an additional stroke of bad luck, he wasn't receiving any signal from his camera bot either, and while it was hard to make out whatever was occurring on the ground beneath him in the plaza, he believed he saw the remains of his robot near the edge of the flood zone next to a frog-like girl, a blonde, and some small purple-haired midget. It looked half-decayed, so he presumed the students used his device as protection from Shigaraki. He would have applauded the student's cleverness if he wasn't upset at losing 2 drones in one day. These things weren't exactly easy to make, despite their ramshackle appearance. Izuku wasn't about to risk losing a 3rd drone by sending one down to talk to All Might, who looked exceptionally distraught at the sight of one of his students dangling limply by her wrists from Izuku's transportation system. He'd have to make his demands in a day or 2 with an anonymous letter, or something like that. All Might was clearly incapacitated, however, if the steam pouring off his body was any indication of his limits. He must have pushed himself hard just to get here. It was likely that he was simply struggling to maintain his muscle form even now, so Shigaraki and Kurogiri didn't see the full extent of his weakness, allowing himself this small amount of satisfaction. Izuku shot the enraged Shigaraki a lazy, 2-fingered salute as he soared out of the USJ's dome, and just in time, too. He could make out the figures of what Izuku presumed to be the rest of the school's staff barge in through the main doors right before he was welcomed back into the sunlight outside, his drones immediately moving as fast as they could to carry their cargo to Dagaba Beach. It took about 5 minutes before Izuku escaped the tree line surrounding the USJ and he entered into the city proper, his drones still carrying him in the rocker high above the ground. While he was no doubt little more than a speck to many, he was sure the internet would be filled with grainy footage of his flight, and the news would no doubt be speculating about his obvious captive. No heroes or police cars appeared to be following him on the ground. Not that Izuku could see much of anything down there as high up as he was, but by the time he reached the beach 10 minutes later and started to descend down towards the sandy, trash-covered shore, he felt assured that he had flew high enough to evade the authorities for the time being. Touching down onto the shores, Izuku quickly hopped off his perch on the rusty hook that suspended him in air, digging around in his landing zone for the wheelchair he'd set aside earlier. The green-haired teen unfolded it as fast as he could before depositing the rocker's still form into the chair. He tossed a blanket over her body to hide the cuffed wrists, and threw a pair of large sunglasses over her eyes and plopped a sun hat atop her head. The teen commanded his drones to nestle themselves amongst the mountains of trash that still littered the beach, his ramshackle inventions perfectly camouflaging with the mounds of rubbish. One of his transports sought to bury itself inside various pieces of discarded furniture, the other utilized its hook to pull open a discarded fridge and hide inside, and his combat bot shoved itself inside the shattered remains of an old, large tube television. Walking over to the fridge one of his transports had sought refuge inside, Izuku slammed the door shut as he stripped off his radio pack and removed the jumpsuit and gloves from his body. Various scars ranging from blunt force trauma, stabbings, and brands littered his torso, arms, and legs, a testament to his time spent with Overhaul. His body would have been covered in far more markings if the boss didn't occasionally tear him apart with his quirk and then piece him back together, fresh as the day he was born. He never got a chance to fix the latest damage he caused before Izuku escaped with Eri. Distant sirens snapped Izuku out of his musings, and he frantically searched around for the yellow bag he left at the beach last night. Spotting his pack near a rotten cabinet, Izuku yanked out his old school uniform from within and rapidly stuffed Jury Rig's outfit inside. He must have set new records for dressing in school uniforms that day, because in a few seconds he was already power-walking away from his landing zone, confident the cops wouldn't be able to find his drones amongst the trash. They'd simply assumed that the villain had wandered off and gone elsewhere. To be fair, that assumption was correct. Izuku had already pushed the girl up the beach ramp and was walking towards the closest sidewalk, making sure to keep one hand on the taser in his pocket in case she woke up and needed to be gently encouraged to go back to sleep. Even as police cruisers careened past Izuku as he traveled down the street, they didn't pay any attention to the green-haired, brightly smiling teen with a skip in his step as he strolled down to Mustafu's industrial district, the location of his base. It took a solid 30 minutes to reach the abandoned warehouse he called home, and Izuku felt beyond tired both from the brisk pace he walked with and from forcing himself to smile and wave at anybody he passed by in the city as he approached. No one suspected the bright, happy child pushing the sleeping form of what many likely assumed to be his sister could be the villainous Jury Rig, or even that such a young man could be capable of harming anybody in the slightest. Approaching the dilapidated remains of the building's loading dock, Izuku cast his gaze suspiciously around the area, searching for any and all potential witnesses. Satisfied that he saw no one nearby, Izuku snapped his fingers, summoning another drone that burst forth from a nearby dumpster. This drone was one of his first designs and had a very singular purpose. It rammed things. It was essentially his base drone chassis with extra armor plating on the front, for the sole purpose of smashing any intruders that got too close to his hideout. It'd be a good distraction if he ever needed to relocate due to heroes. Today, though, Izuku simply instructed the drone to push the girl's wheelchair forward, so he could have his hands free to fiddle with the keypad he'd installed into the warehouse's door. It required 2 hands to use, one hand that entered the simple code to get into the building, but in order for the code to work, one would need to use their second hand to press down on a disguised button built into the surface of the wall itself, appearing for all intents and purposes like a small chunk of concrete that had decayed from the main structure itself. Even if someone guessed the code or spied Izuku keying it in, it'd be unlikely they understood the significance of Izuku pressing his other hand against the wall while he did so. The door unlocked. The several automatic deadbolts he hastily welded to the other side readily opened up, allowing Izuku to enter his abode. Its job fulfilled, the drone Izuku summoned earlier re-entered its dumpster, closing the lid as it settled in with a simple, robotic claw Izuku attached to its chassis for that exact purpose. Taking the taser out of his pocket, Izuku leveled the black and yellow device against the girl's shoulder, just in case she decided to try anything once she regained her bearings. With that broken leg, though, she wouldn't be going anywhere without assistance, and with those quirk-suppressing gauntlets, she stood no chance against the various derelict drones and other robots littering the concrete floor of his warehouse, all appearing to be in various stages of completion. Glancing down at his captive, Izuku was glad to see the rocker understood the situation she was currently in. If the lack of struggling and death glare being sent at him from behind those shades were any indication, since his face was currently uncovered, he simply showed off that bright, reassuring smile he always equipped when someone was questioning him. He was excited. Izuku would be keeping this girl as a captive for at least a week or 2, and he could grill her for all the information on 1A's students, plus her own quirk. He couldn't wait to start up his next hero analysis notebook. "Daddy," a small voice called out from within the warehouse. A small, white-haired child with a single horn skipping out from around a shipping crate to greet the visitor she was told Izuku'd be bringing to their home. The sight of his surrogate daughter eased Izuku's tension slightly. It was good to see everything remained all right in his absence. Meanwhile, Kyoka couldn't believe her eyes. She must have still been reeling from that taser, because there was no way in hell that this teenager that apparently kidnapped her had a young, adorable-looking daughter. He was far, far too young for that. The little girl appeared to be around 4 or 5 years old, and there was a tall-looking robot next to her that appeared to be some nightmarish fusion of a trash can and various other household appliances. It wore a tie around what she presumed was its neck, and had plush-looking white gloves attached to the rusty, chain-covered appendages that seemed to serve as its arms. She could only guess what its hands looked like under the fabric. "Did you finally bring home a mommy like you promised?" she asked with the innocence only a child could possess, bright red eyes gleaming with joy and her radiant smile rivaling the luminosity of the sun itself. While Kyoka's mouth had dropped open in shock and a light blush dusted across her cheeks, she retained enough brain function to bend her head to glance at her freckled captor under the brim of the sun hat she wore, his previously pale face now redder than a tomato as his mouth opened and closed. No sounds came out, but he did seem to occasionally squeak or stutter a bit. Just what kind of villain was she dealing with here? How was she supposed to react to this situation, exactly? It had to be a trick. It just had to be. This guy was just trying to get her to drop her guard, so he could do something. But what would he do now that he couldn't do before? She wasn't exactly in a position to fight back. She'd already tried using her earphone jacks to stab the villain in the eyes, but they could barely move around at all right now. She'd tried to move her hands, but quickly discovered those bulky gauntlets kept them firmly placed together, and her leg was still busted up. Even if she could move her hands or run, she'd have to deal with that taser pressed up against her collarbone, the one which the villainous teenager currently had his finger on the trigger. And now his daughter was asking if she was gonna be her mother. Jiro wasn't happy. She did not just get kidnapped to be turned into some bride for this lunatic. She was going to ignore her love for that old animated film Beauty and the Beast and any completely irrelevant fantasies she may or may not have had about its plot while growing up and dreaming to be a hero. The real question was, how should she respond to this situation? It'd require a certain amount of finesse. Psychotic villain threatening her with a taser notwithstanding. If this was an actual child, and not just some young-looking woman, she didn't want to upset her. She was raised with some standards. All right, just like how your parents taught you. Deep breath. Take a moment to collect yourself, ready your inner thoughts. What's the appropriate response to "Did you bring back a mommy like you promised?" Fuck no, he didn't. The rocker spat, indignation quite clear in her voice. Nailed it. Wait, so much for all those lessons she'd had to take about thinking before she spoke. Well, what's the worst that would happen? She'd survive a few beatings, even if it sucked. As she prepared for a taser zap or a punch to the face, she found herself entirely unprepared for the villain, lightly bopping her on the head with his free hand. Oi, she's barely 5, watch your language, he complained, all of his prior embarrassment gone, now sounding rather annoyed with just a touch of anger. Honestly, are all you heroes in training as bad as Kakin? Sheesh. But Dad, you promised. The small girl whined, shooting the villain behind her the largest pair of puppy dog eyes she'd ever seen. Puppy dog eyes. Like she was being told she couldn't have a bar of chocolate at the convenience store. She was a hostage. Why was this kid treating her like a Russian mail-order bride? Well, mother, not bride, but the point stands. She heard the villain sigh behind her, as if they'd had this conversation 1,000 times before. Oh God. What if he was just kidnapping women to be this kid's mom and then killing them when they disappoint her? Oh hell no, this isn't happening. This can't be fucking happening. She half mumbled, half rambled, now more motivated than ever to get away. The villain, apparently, had other things on his mind, however. What the fuck did I just say about cursing? Goddammit. Fuck you, she retorted, being in absolutely no mood for his delicate sensibilities. Hero hopeful and villainous apprentice continued to trade expletive barbs on the warehouse floor. Obscenities shouted at one another, becoming increasingly belligerent and less cohesive. The entire time, a red-eyed unicorn stood with a gaping mouth next to her robotic companion rumbling along beside her, unable to look away from that train wreck in motion. It was perfect. They'd even started talking like all those couples did in the shows she watched. Tugging on the sleeve of the friend Papa had built for her, Eri excitedly pointed towards the couple. It's Mama and Papa's first fight. For some reason, her comment caused Mama to shout even louder than she was previously. Nezu, while the wielder of superhuman intelligence, was at his very base an animal. He was still a slave to the emotions and instincts that came from being one, unlike humanity, which had largely bred out of all but their most hard-coded natural responses. One could say that humans and Nezu shared the same instincts really, but Nezu simply had them dialed up to 11. One of those instincts, something he knew to be coming from the predator DNA inside his genome, was telling him he was in very, very grave danger. Some prey species could be particularly deadly, and an excellent method of inciting their rage was by threatening their offspring. It was a base instinct really, a warning light in his head. Think twice before you try and eat their kid. He wasn't eating anyone's kid, of course, but the sentiment was still there. Don't mess with anyone's kids, lest you incite their rage. It was rather unfortunate that he'd managed to incite the Jiro family's rage. It wasn't entirely his fault. He understood perfectly well the parents' right to be outraged and frightened, and for that he held no animosity towards them. When he was forced to call up the family to inform them about the unfortunate incident at the USJ, he was intentionally vague. He wasn't going to say over the phone, "Hey, your daughter's been kidnapped. Swing on by when you can." That was just asking for the pair to engage in thoroughly reckless driving, endangering not only their lives but the lives of others. He fully intended to reveal, face to face, the unfortunate fate that had befallen their only daughter. Again, unfortunately, someone called them and spilled the beans early. Now, not only did they know their daughter was kidnapped, they believed that Nezu had deliberately hidden that information from them. It was an accurate statement, but, well, it was for a good reason. That wasn't something you told someone over the phone. He was doing his level best to keep his breathing under control. Normally, he was quite unflappable. This situation, while taxing, didn't come anywhere near to toppling the walls of Nezu's prodigious willpower. He wasn't even particularly bothered by the veritable death glares being sent across the desk he was sat behind from the parents in question. Though another part of his DNA, some remnant from a prey species most likely, was readily comparing Mika Jiru's twitching earjacks to a snake ready to strike. The father seemed to be holding his voice in, and, if he recalled the man's quirk correctly, something to do with voice projection, he was quite thankful he wasn't screaming his ear out like a discount present mic. See, in inciting the parents' rage, he apparently encouraged them to use their very large bank account to their advantage. The presence of no less than 11 different lawyers crowded around behind the two was proof of that. Therein lay the problem. It felt like he was back in those damn labs again, being scrutinized by scientists staring at him from over the rim of their glasses, writing down his reactions, ready to take samples, always thinking about the next damn test they could put him through. He spent years conditioning that smile on his face to never slip off. Yet in reality, his unchanging expression of muted cheerfulness was actually a carefully crafted mask. That mask was slipping, quite frankly. He wasn't sure whether to be grateful or ungrateful that the one he'd chosen to accompany him for this conference, Hound Dog, noticed his not-so-obvious discomfort and stepped in to take the reins, as it were. Mr. and Mrs. Jiro, we can assure you that the staff of UA are fully committed to the safety of all our students, and as such we are doing everything in our power both as an institute and as pro-heroes to orchestrate the swift, safe return of your daughter. Again, Nezu had to begrudgingly respect the single-minded focus Miss Jiru's parents had in this situation. While the lawyers all seemed momentarily surprised that gruff, frightening Hound Dog was one of the most eloquent individuals around when he needed to be, the two furious parents didn't so much as glance in his direction. Her tone low and dangerous, the Jiro matriarch managed to growl out through gritted teeth, "It has been 4 days since the semester has begun into our daughter's hero education, and, already, she has been kidnapped on school grounds in broad daylight. I was under the impression that All Might was supposed to be supervising her field trip today." It took more of Nezu's willpower than he'd like to admit, preventing himself from gulping. Again, the unusual circumstances surrounding the entire assault necessitated a level of secrecy. They couldn't just go around saying that an entire group of villains attacked the USJ with the express purpose of killing All Might with what was looking more and more like a genetically engineered bioweapon. Nor could he reveal that All Might couldn't use his quirk as effectively as he once had, even if that was the reason their daughter ended up in this very situation. Hell, figuring out how those villains knew All Might had a literal gaping hole in his side was another headache in the making. We hold no illusions regarding the unfortunate circumstances that have us gathered here now. While your anger is both warranted and understandable, antagonizing UA with your roving band of attack lawyers here won't return young Jiro any faster. Any sort of litigation against the UA staff, who are already shaping up to be the primary contacts in this case, will ultimately interfere with their duties. Mika narrowed her eyes dangerously at the furred man. Are you threatening the Jiro family's right to pursue legal action against UAS faculty? One of the aforementioned attack lawyers opinionated, glaring at the school counselor over the rim of his square spectacles. Hound Dog was quick to reassure them. Absolutely not. I am merely suggesting that they take appropriate timing into account before they act. I support their right to pursue what they believe they should. However, it would be prudent to hold off on any litigation until the current crisis has been averted. Having the primary investigators in the case bogged down with paperwork from lawsuits will only slow down their progress. Like vultures, the lawyers huddled together and whispered to one another in hushed tones that even Nezu and his above-average hearing had difficulty discerning. It seemed the Jiro matriarch was responsible for her daughter's enhanced hearing, however, because she leaned back into the pack and whispered something into one of their ears before seemingly dismissing them with a hand wave. As a group, the band proceeded to make their way out Nezu's door, but one of the younger ones in a sharp, if cheap, dress suit stopped just short of the threshold and sent a pointed look towards the principal. We'll be in touch. Don't think the resolution of this conflict will change our opinion. Her piece said, she resumed her march out. Nezu was quite certain that the young lawyer at the end was related somehow to the Jiros. At the very least, they were close family friends. There was an unusual level of harshness in her eyes, which were shaped much like the Jiro woman's own, vaguely triangular. Obviously, nothing definitive, but Nezu was grasping for just about anything to take his mind off of the unfortunate reminder he'd been given about his past. For the first time, the father spoke up, his tone barely above that of a whisper. Congratulations. Now that we've gotten rid of our legal team, is UAS illustrious principal able to answer our questions? Or should we strive to be more accommodating? Nezu resisted the urge to growl. Again, it wasn't entirely their fault since he certainly didn't advertise his past history of actual torture, nor his acquired distaste for groups of humans that looked vaguely professional. To them, he was just nervous because they brought lawyers into the room, not because they were unintentionally stepping on one of his triggers. He wasn't going to correct their assumption either. One doesn't just mention, "Oh, I was tortured earlier in life and hate people who vaguely remind me of scientists." He'd deal with the fallout later. UAS wallet could take whatever they threw at him, really. Settling out of court was easy when you had his budget. It'd be more trivial than anything else. Hound Dog was thankful that, for one reason or another, Mika Jiro seemed to give up on her strategy of antagonizing UA as she heaved a great big sigh and seemed to fold in on herself. Look, just what can you tell us about our daughter? You obviously don't know where she is right now, but can you tell us about her condition before the kidnapping? We've gathered that this wasn't simply a small villain attack based on the sheer number of emergency vehicles posted around the place. Again, Nezu had to suppress the urge to wince. Damn emergency services. At this rate, UA would be forced to somewhat acknowledge the true scale of what occurred. Obviously, that information would be revealed eventually, but this was exactly what the villains wanted, at least as a secondary objective, to cause a huge scene and undermine everyone's faith in UA. In that regard, their plan was going spectacularly well. If only their staff had been injured like they were, they probably would have just gone ahead and told the press what occurred. As it was, there was a kidnapping mixed up in all this ruckus, plus definitive proof that at least 2 of the villains there knew about All Might's weakness. They had to investigate some of this first, before they decided what to reveal to the press. While we can't go deep into details of the attack quite yet, we'll be sure to let you all know the full reality of the situation as soon as possible. As for your daughter's state, she was with one of her classmates at the time of the incident, one Momoye Irazu. From her report on the situation, her most grievous injury was a broken leg, along with a few cuts and scrapes. While there's nothing in her medical file we have on her, just to be sure, your daughter doesn't have any heart conditions, correct? No, but why is this information necessary to know? Kyoyoku inquired, narrowing his eyes suspiciously at Hound Dog. Deciding he'd remain silent for too long, the mouse rat bear thing that was UAS principal chimed into the conversation, his normally cheery tone slightly subdued. By Monsieur Arazu's admission, the villain utilized a taser-like device to neutralize both her and your daughter. We simply wanted to acquire reassurance that wouldn't have endangered her health. She had a broken leg, you said? Mika asked, attempting to hide her wince at the principal's admission. Unfortunately, yes. However, there is a silver lining here. Nezu spoke, a modicum of pep flowing back into his voice. While this isn't anything ideal, of course, this villain is believed to have interacted with another one of our students, one Ochako Uraraka. In our interviews with the various students, she disclosed that it was thanks to this villain's own input that she was able to administer advanced first aid to one of our faculty members, one whose mutant physiology made normal first aid techniques impossible. Not only that, he protected both your daughter and Monsieur Irazu before he attacked them. The parents exchanged confused glances with one another, unsure of what to do with that information. The villain ... What? I'm sorry, we don't see how information constitutes a silver lining. Hound Dog jumped back in. Well, from the villain's actions, we can infer that he has an ulterior motive here. Our leading theory is he's hedging his bets with his actions, so when he's arrested, he can point to these acts as reason for leniency. Kyoyoku looked down, apparently deep in thought, while Mika's eyes seemed to shine a little from behind her glasses. You're implying that it's unlikely he'll do any further harm to our daughter. She half-whispered, relief clear in her voice. Not only that, he reportedly attempted to pacify Yaoyorozu during the kidnapping with the reassurance that he'd get your daughter to a medic. Our investigative efforts will start looking at individuals who provide medical services to villains, with the hope that one of them has been hired to assist your daughter. The principal elaborated, folding his furry paws atop one another. Hopefully, this situation would be resolved rather quickly. It was unfortunate that Aizawa would be unable to use his expertise as an underground hero to bring about an even quicker end. But with the rest of UAS staff on the cause, he was confident this wouldn't last for long. Miss Jiro would just have to endure whatever the villain was subjecting her to for now. Again, Jiro found herself blindsided by the villain's actions. It was only a small consolation that his current unpredicted behavior was plausible, if strange. He was a medic, apparently a semi-decent one too. He'd already removed the splint Yaoyorozu had set her leg in earlier, and replaced it with a full medical boot, after ensuring the bone was correctly set back in place. How'd he do that? He pulled out an entire X-ray machine from somewhere, and snapped a few pictures. While the machine was very clearly second-hand, it still functioned well enough to get the job done. A few butterfly bandages and some antiseptic ointment covered the various cuts and scrapes she received from the earlier villains, and she was already well on the road to recovery. Does this hurt? Poke. Jiro winced and resisted the urge to growl at the small child poking a purple-blue bruise forming upon her leg. Really, the only thing preventing her from doing so was fear of retaliation from the villain. What she wanted was for him to make the child go away. To his credit, he attempted it. However, he, much like her own father, was incredibly weak to puppy dog eyes, and damn if the child didn't have the most pitiful-looking sad face in existence. Hell, she almost felt sympathy for the guy when she activated the waterworks. Suffice to say, the child was still here, in her cell, which happened to be better furnished than her entire room back home. It made sense, she supposed, because after all, her cell was an entire RV. She was pretty sure there wasn't even a padlock on the front door. However, she would have to give him credit for that because there wasn't really any need for a padlock considering he had that weird butler robot of his wandering around outside of security. She was quite certain that with his level of tech, any escape attempt on her part would be met with severe resistance. Plus, her leg. She was definitely not getting anywhere with that thing. Sure, he may have set it in the boot, but she was not in any condition to fight metal minions. Humans she could punch, or stab, or knock out, or stab. Attempting to stab a robot would be an exercise in utter futility unless her knife was exceptionally sharp. Turning to the side, Kyoka observed the room she was in once more from her position on a couch shoved into the corner of the cell. The first thing she saw towards the far end of the RV, opposite her current location, was a small kitchenette with all the bells and whistles plus a plain black mini fridge. Past that was a small, flimsy-looking plastic door that likely led to the bedroom. However, the room beyond it might have been converted into something more nefarious. Another small door near that connected to what looked like a particularly compact space which, judging by the way the rest of this place presented as, was probably an honest-to-goodness bathroom. Directly in front of her was a decently sized flat-screen TV. A small recliner sat perpendicular to the couch, the only other seat in the room, and string lights that hung from the ceiling and draped across the floor adequately illuminated the whole space. A dull, navy blue, entirely uninteresting carpet served as the flooring, with a few dark splotches where something obviously spilled onto the fabric, breaking up the utter monotony of the entire thing. As if sensing her intent, the villain chimed in with a very helpful, "Knives are in the second drawer, furthest from the mini fridge. Don't get your hopes up too much, they're plastic. Sure, you could still stab me with that, but you'd starve to death trying to get out my front door. Good luck guessing the 10-digit passcode." KYOKA grumbled incoherently. Stupid, smart-ass villains. Finally, at long last, Shigaraki was asleep. Just to be sure though, Dr. Garaki injected even more sedative into him. The last thing he wanted was for that man-child's motor myth to start back up again. He supposed that all the villains wiggling around wasn't helping the doctor stitch up his latest wounds. But his primary reason for sedation was to shut him up. He could only take so much of the man's inane ramblings about hero society before he got a headache. Perhaps he'd been spoiled thanks to his talks with Sensei. While All for One didn't have the same practical knowledge Garaki did, he was still highly intelligent and was an excellent conversation partner, especially in matters of philosophical debate. By contrast, Shigaraki was a mewling brat, with a great big sigh appropriate for someone of his advanced age. Kyudai finished up the remaining stitches on the boy's thigh. Honestly, he was lucky Snipe was there to stop him. The man had a reputation for non-lethal takedowns, which, considering his quirk, was a true blessing for Tamura. Had the hero's morals not been as high as they currently were, he'd be dead. Actually, Garaki would have preferred that. It would have meant All for One could finally abandon this foolish project of his and move on to locating a far more worthy successor. Kyudai was convinced the sole reason Sensei put up with all of them was simply because the man was related to Nana Shimura. Had that factor been different, he truly believed All for One would have already moved on to a far more competent, more mentally sound successor. A small smile came to the doctor's face at the thought of the USJ attack. However, Izuku Midoriya, jury rig, successfully escaped the USJ with a hostage in tow, according to Shigaraki. Hell, even the news was finally starting to pick up on that nugget of information. He'd even seen the pictures and a very, very blurry cell phone video of Midoriya's flight away from the USJ with the girl hanging from one of his ramshackle drones. Hopefully, Sensei would see reason and acknowledge the Greenette's superiority over Shigaraki. He certainly never would have pegged that small, tiny child who cried when Kyudai diagnosed him as quirkless all those years ago would grow up to be a criminal genius. But what could he say? The kid had good genes. Perhaps he should have expected it, really. He allowed his first impressions of the child and his all-might fanaticism to color his opinions. Hopefully, he was getting whatever information he wanted out of that hostage of his by now. Maybe if he broke her, Sensei would recognize the child's clear ruthlessness and take the boy on as his true successor. So, want a pizza or something? You're not very good at this hostage-keeping thing, are you? KYOKA retorted, having long since abandoned any hope for normalcy. Well, whatever definition of normal applied for kidnapping situations. Again, in a move that surprised KYOKA, the villain's eyes seemed to take on a much darker overtone, and his relaxed posture seemed to dip into something more villainous, she supposed. The shadows cast by the hanging string light shadowed all the right parts of his face to really up the intimidation factor as well. I don't expect you to be thankful, because surprisingly, I do get it. You've been kidnapped. It ain't fun. However, I think you should count your blessings at your current situation here. What you define as me being bad at this thing is, in fact, my attempt at hospitality. She narrowed her eyes at the teen, matching his glare with one of her own. What, you want my thanks for breaking my leg, and then locking me up in a trailer? If this is some horrendously constructed plan to get me on your side, forget it. Not happening. Undaunted by her retort, he replied, No, I'm not nearly that deluded. I do, however, expect someone of your caliber to be smart enough to recognize that these privileges you have now are just that. Privileges. You want to eat nothing but soup and water for a few weeks? Fine by me. Want to sleep on a concrete floor with a cement bag and a towel for bedding? I can make that happen. I recognize the power dynamic here. You have no reason to trust me. Still, I'm going to say this. He took a breath, paused for a beat, and then launched into his tirade. I have no intention of harming you. I have no intention of forcing you to do anything against your will, beyond maybe recording a heavily scripted message or two as proof that you're alive. After I've done my job, you'll be free to go back to your life at UA. No worse for wear beyond being bereft of a few weeks of coursework that you'll probably have to make up. Again, Jiro trusted this guy about as far as she could throw him. Considering she was still handcuffed, that distance was even shorter than normal. Still, she was currently at his mercy and couldn't fight back, which meant she might as well try to do something that would be useful in the future. Gathering information. And what, exactly, is your job as you've put it? His smirk transformed into a predatory grin. UAS staff is composed of some of Japan's topmost heroes, and said heroes have information I want on a certain bank they all utilize. The Mustafa Central Bank, actually, official resting place of UAS very extensive financial assets. I've had guys staking out this place for months, and even went through the trouble of sneaking a guy inside on the damn staff, but I still can't seem to get the damn vault codes keeping a lock on UAS finances. If those heroes don't have the information I want, I'm sure they'll be able to at least tell me exactly how to get it. KYOKA rolled her eyes. Why villains love to explain their plans at the slightest provocation, she'd never understand. It was a real problem though. Villain psychologists even had a damn name for it. Exposition syndrome. Still, this worked in her favor. If she got out, either through her own machinations or through being rescued, she'd readily spill the beans on this operation he seemed to be planning. She even knew there was a mole in the bank's staff now. TCH, always money with you villains. You know there's more important things in life, right? She jeered, disguising her elation with not so falsified disdain. To his credit, the villain was nothing if not a stickler to his ideals. I've yet to meet a problem money couldn't solve, my unwilling friend. Even taking 5% of UAS financial assets would have me set for a very, very long time. The unicorn sitting by her side decided now was the perfect time to add in her 2 cents. Huh, I thought you were gonna use Mama as a distraction, so you could steal UAS robot designs. KYOKA's eyes widened, as did the villain's, before he, in a manner that was all too reminiscent of a robot, moved forward and plucked the child away from her side. The girl readily clung to the villain, happily snuggling into his shoulder even as he, with a totally blank face, quietly exited the RV. A small click reverberated throughout the room as he closed the door, leaving KYOKA alone with a smirk steadily growing upon her face. He thought he was smart, did he? Trying to feed her false information. Well, maybe next time he'd think twice about leaving his daughter around when he was expositing his plans to her. Already, she was warming up to that child. She'd have to consider playing nice with her, even if it meant tolerating the new moniker of Mama for a time. If she played her cards right, she might be able to get that little unicorn to spell out his entire plan. After walking a safe distance away from the RV, Izuku bent down and placed Eri back on the concrete floor of his warehouse, whereupon her little shoes happily did a tiny tap dance as she not so quietly cheered. Before she could make any noticeable vocalizations, Izuku managed to make a shushing gesture with his hands, and while she was still physically vibrating with excitement, she still managed to keep her voice down to a whisper. "Did I do good, Papa?" she asked, her crimson orbs animatedly shimmering in anticipation. Fondly, Izuku reached down and ruffled her hair, eliciting a tiny squeal of joy from her. "I couldn't have paid someone to do a better job." "Excellent work, Eri." Still, while Eri had certainly played her part in the spreading of misinformation like he'd planned, there was just one little sniglet that bothered him. Eri, he began, squinting a little as the child tilted her head in a manner all too reminiscent of a confused puppy. "Did you have to call her Mama?" With far too much innocence for her own damn good, the child stared back at Izuku like he was, to put it politely, slow. "Why wouldn't I call Mama that?" Izuku swallowed. "All right, damage control time, before this got bad. Eri, sweetie, I know I promised you a mama, and I do intend to get you one, but she's not who I've picked out for that job, all right," he explained as gently as he could, hoping that this wouldn't send his surrogate daughter into a depressive slump. She was currently happier than she normally was, damn it. He didn't want a misunderstanding to ruin it. Recognition seemed to flash through her eyes, and her radiant smile dropped down to an indifferent countenance, all warmth vacating her gaze. "Oh," she said, in lieu of any explanation. The child rocked back and forth on her heels for a moment, crossing her arms behind her back as she appeared to mull something over in her head. With a gasp, her smile came racing back and she clutched her tiny fists in front of her mouth to hide her excitement. "Can we adopt her like you adopted me, then?" she shouted out, far louder than Izuku would have liked. Thump, swallowing the lump in his throat, and ignoring the loud noise coming from the RV he'd left behind, Izuku decided he was far too tired to deal with this at the moment, nor was he inclined to ruin Eri's good mood. We'll see. I'm gonna go make sure our guest didn't, hurt anything." Again, his daughter giggled, totally oblivious to the situation she'd placed the two of them into. "Can we still get pizza?" Well, stress eating was a Midoriya family trait, and while Izuku didn't participate in it nearly as often as his mother did, there was a time and a place for everything. Considering how stressed he was right now, he figured it was a good time to delve into old habits of seeking comfort. Playing with Eri was his typical coping mechanism, but he had a feeling any activities he did with the girl, be it cooking or playing any sort of game, would likely include conversations regarding the hostage he was regretting taking by the second. Geez, he really was bad at this hostage-taking thing, huh? Alright, I suggest we do a quick roll call to assess our attendance. Ida, everyone's name is literally on the screen here. You don't need to call for attendance. It seemed the robot-like teen appearing to have a small crisis over the mere concept of not taking attendance at the start of a meeting was enough to eke out a few smiles from several of the students. A much-needed moment of levity in an otherwise awful day. One thing Momo noticed right off the bat, staring at all the moving pictures captured by her classmates' webcams, was how utterly uninjured they all were. The worst looking was Minta, who appeared to have a black eye and a long, angry welt atop his forehead. Maybe a villain with a whip smacked him or something. And perhaps it was simply a trick of the camera, but she could swear some of her classmates were shaking. She wouldn't blame them if they were. She was still shaking, after all. It honestly hurt, looking at everyone's faces, because they were missing one. Well, 3. But Uraraka said she had to field a call from her family first and Kirishima was unable to get Bakugo to come on for the meeting, which, honestly, surprised no one. However, it still hurt, reading over the list of names on the screen over and over again, each time coming away disappointed when the simple words KYOKA Jiro didn't show up. Yaorazu didn't know her all that well, but she already respected the young woman a great deal. She was sure they would have become fast friends. The rocker didn't seem to care that she was from money, nor was she afraid to speak her mind which, coming from a family based entirely around appearances, was quite the breath of fresh air. Da-ding. Achako's face suddenly appeared on everyone's screen. Her brown bob cut slightly disheveled and sticking up in random places, her face still a little dirty from the earlier incident. It looked like she'd tried to wash it off with a towel or something. But there were still a few grimy smears on her cheeks. Again, Aorazu didn't blame her. The only reason she was as clean as she currently looked was because she moved on autopilot as soon as she got home, hoping to find comfort in a familiar routine. It had been ages since she had the maids at her estate apply her makeup. But for the life of her she couldn't get herself to stop trembling, and the mansion staff simply stepped in to assist without saying a word. She'd be giving them a bonus. Hey guys, sorry it took so long. My parents were pretty concerned about everything that happened, the gravity girl explained, carting a hand through her still messy hair. Must have sucked. Not being able to tell him everything, huh? Kaminari hit the nail on the head, for once in his life. Momo barely suppressed a wince at that thought. That was something Jiro would have said about the electric teen. She wasn't entirely sure what their history was, but from what she'd gathered the pair knew each other from childhood. Perhaps not as great friends, but there was a level of familiarity there. Yue had requested that students refrain from talking about the details of the attack for a day, so they could stop any incorrect or misleading rumors from spreading around the media. The faculty was trying to be cautious, considering the nature of the incident. In that sense, as much as it pained her to admit it, they got off easy. A single kidnapping and 2 faculty members seriously injured in an attack of 60-plus villains. And, from what some of her classmates had whispered about to each other, some sort of anti-All Might was getting off lightly. Sadly, that didn't mean it still wasn't painful. The chubby-cheeked girl sighed, hunching over and resting her chin in the palm of her hand. Yeah, it was pretty hard telling my parents that I just couldn't talk to them yet, but they got the message eventually. They're still not gonna be pleased when Yue makes an official statement, though. Wasn't that the truth? Even so, you should be commended for your quick thinking, Uraraka, Ada exclaimed with his patented hand chops, very nearly smashing down on his keyboard with each swing. I saw your exemplary administration of first aid on 13 when I returned with the faculty, and could not have been more impressed. Using Ciro's tape as a sealant for 13's suit was genius. Kind words of encouragement and praise filtered through the video call, Toru leading the charge by waving around little pom-poms. Oddly though, Uraraka looked sad rather than accomplished. Sorry Ida, I can't take credit for that idea. Ever unflappable, the class's vice representative immediately redirected his attention towards Ciro, who looked spectacularly confused. My apologies, Ciro. Your brilliance has shone through in unexpected ways. I commend your ability to think quickly, and your prodigious intelligence in the field of DIY projects. Boo, hate to break it to ya, Rep. I didn't think of it. I just did what Uraraka there told me to. He explained with a slight tilt to his head. Now everyone, including Momo, was confused. Suyu raised up a finger to her chin and, unblinkingly, stared at the camera. It was slightly unsettling. Did another classmate come up with the idea, then? Or 13 herself? Hiro, the gravity girl looked down at her lap and seemed conflicted about something. Before, with a sigh that accurately represented how everyone in the class felt, faced the camera. Sorry, Sue. Unfortunately, I just didn't know what to do. I couldn't see a body in that suit. And I panicked. I was basically just poking her suit really. Until a villain showed up to help me. What? The entire class seemed to shout that out. But the video chat client they were using simply couldn't handle the volume of everyone shouting at once. Hell, even though only about half of the voices were heard, the volume was still impressive, to put it kindly. Question after question was shouted out from everyone at once, with no way to discern who was asking what. Being a responsible class representative, Momo decided to invoke executive privilege and muted everyone besides Ochako. And her. Hey, she never said she wouldn't abuse the power she was given if she was elected. She was a Yaoyorozu, and Yaoyorozus took advantage of any resources at their disposal. My apologies, class, but I've taken the liberty of muting everyone for the moment, so we don't overwhelm Uraraka. That said, Uraraka, and I don't mean to sound pushy, but please explain before I have an aneurysm. The very second her perpetually blushing classmate uttered the words "a villain helped me," a pit had opened up in the rich girl's stomach. Villains were not helpful. Every villain there came with the very clear intention to kill everyone they possibly could and maim anyone else. As mentioned earlier, her classmates even mentioned an anti-All Might, so they really weren't messing around. However, Momo knew of exactly one villain at the USJ that seemed to have an aversion to killing, and even assisted her and Jiro at one point before turning on them. That damned scrap mechanic. Put on the spot, the brunette seemed to stumble over herself for a few moments as she gathered her bearings. Well, you see, I was just sitting there by 13's side and, I didn't know what to do, and then this drone of some sort came swooping down from above. Looked like it was made from the remains of some huge camera and a box of scrap metal really. But it started speaking Tommy and gave me an idea on how to help 13. While her face remained impassive, Momo had to resist the urge to squint at her classmate through the camera, because the impressive word salad that slipped out of her mouth, complete with an accent slip at the end there, was difficult to parse through. What she did gather, however, was that her worst fears were confirmed. A little ding drew her attention back towards the screen, where a little message had popped up from the class's resident pervert, which while she would normally ignore, had relevant information in it this time around. Hey Tsuyu, didn't you save us from that hand guy with a drone like that? You dragged it down to earth with your tongue to block his path. Asui's facecam showed that her mouth was moving, and, realizing she'd left everyone muted by accident, quickly corrected her mistake, starting with the resident frog girl. I did use a drone like that to save us, Kiro. The hand villain seemed to have some kind of disintegration quirk. He used it on Aizawa-sensei and turned half the drone into a pile of ash. As Yaoyorozu continued to unmute her classmates one by one, many of them blanched at her partial explanation. She, however, couldn't help the frown that marred her features, knowing that the villain who bested them in combat did so while multitasking elsewhere in the facility. He defeated the pair of them even when he wasn't paying full attention to the battlefield he was on. Momo always wondered why he just kind of stood there after she shot him off his drones. And now she had a pretty good idea. Yeah, Minda chimed in. No longer muted, I knew that thing sounded familiar. Handman had a drone too, before it, spontaneously blew up for some reason after All Might arrived. That was rather unusual, Kiro. Classmates continued to bicker, with others chiming in and asking questions. Ada berating Uraraka for interacting with a villain, while Shiro and others started defending her. This was just too damn crazy. With an audible thunk, Momo simply gave up and let her head smash down onto her desk, groaning in frustration. Every little bit of information she gathered on this villain just made her more confused. She couldn't understand what his deal was. He's there participating in the attack with all those murderers, but for some reason saved her and Jiru's life. Just when she was starting to think maybe he had some weird I won't kill creed going on, it turns out he, in all likelihood, armed one of the other villains with a drone, and said villain then used the drone to try and kill their teacher. Hell, to add insult to injury, it was thanks to that villain's intervention that she was carried to the entrance of the USJ, too. Again, that information was muddled with the knowledge that he assisted Uraraka in saving 13's life. And all of this, every single action he performed at the USJ, was done while he was fighting against her and Jiro. Just how useless was she? That mechanic called her skimpy, and then barely seemed to pay any attention to her while they fought. Hell, in their little battle, she barely did anything. She may have struck the first blow, but after that she was pretty useless. Jiro did most of the heavy lifting against him and suffered the consequences for it. She should have been faster. She should have made more ammo when she had the chance. Hell, she should have something more dangerous than a crossbow that shot boxing gloves. Please, you all right? A gruff yet kind voice, probably Kirishima's, inquired. Momo managed to summon enough energy to lift her head off her desk and look at the various concerned, confused faces of her classmates' facecams, not bothering to try and keep her appearances up anymore. Her classmate, Todoroki, was much like Tsuyu in the sense that when he spoke, it was usually with little regard for social norms, whereas with her frog-like classmate, that disregard seemed to stem from a desire for honesty. With Todoroki, that disregard seemed to come from a total lack of social awareness. As such, when he spoke, it really hit harder than it shoulda. Well, Yaoyorozu was unable to prevent Jiro's kidnapping. She's probably upset about that. Many of the class took offense to his blunt statement, but he wasn't wrong by any measure. She did fail to prevent her classmate's kidnapping. A quirk as amazing as hers, the ability to create anything, and she got bested by someone who looked like they armed themselves at a thrift shop. Todoroki, such accusations are wildly unfounded. Not to mention rude. I have total faith our class president did everything in her power to defend Jiro. Ida chimed, readily jumping to his president's defense. It's all right, Ida. He's not wrong. Momo waved off his defense, ignoring many of the class's shocked looks. Still, she immediately sought to clarify what she meant. It's just, well, the villain who kidnapped Jiro. The villain who kidnapped Jiro was, well, I think he was the creator of all those drones. In a rare display of emotion, Asui's eyes widened ever so slightly, even as Uraraka reeled back in shock, her hands shooting up to her mouth as tears seemed to well up in the corner of her eyes. What do you mean, Mo? What makes you think that particular villain made those things? Mina questioned, using that strange, short nickname she'd taken to calling the heiress in the school's locker room. Biting her lip, an old nervous habit. Momo actually thought about it for all of 2 seconds before deciding to double down. There was absolutely no doubt in her mind that the villain was those drones' controller and most likely creator as well. Ah, yes, Asu, sorry, Tsu. That was the villain we fought. He had this weird backpack with a satellite dish on his back. I think it either somehow amplifies his quirk, or he uses it to control the drones without a quirk. He's some sort of technopath, or at the very least, has a machine-based quirk. He had 3 drones flying around him at all times and used 2 of them to fly. He seemed to be able to speak through them, and I actually think I know exactly when he was talking to Uraraka halfway through our battle because he spaced out and just stood there, staring at something on his glasses. He's rigged them up with a sort of display feature or something along those lines. Many of the class looked down, contemplating all the new information they'd just been delivered. It seemed Uraraka was taking it the hardest. And it was obvious she was fairly thankful, if not confused, by the villain's assistance, and had probably gotten it into her head that he wasn't a horrendous person. Now, her image of the man had been tainted by the knowledge that while he was helping her save 13's life, he was actively trying to harm the girl's friends at the same time. Honestly, Momo was utterly confused. She liked to think she had an okay handle on villain psychology. She'd certainly studied the subject and preemptively read several books on the subject because she knew UA would have a course into her lessons, and she wanted to stay ahead of the game. This guy's playbook, she couldn't grasp it. He was the embodiment of chaos, just doing things with no regard for the morality of it, or simply because the idea crossed his mind at the time. It was maddening. One thing was certain, however, Yaoyorozu's didn't give up over a simple roadblock. They pushed on, bribed the local officials, bought out the competition, and then steamrolled anything that remained of what was once a simple mom-and-pop startup in the name of capitalism. She'd figure out this villain's Mo, no matter what it took. Yue may be trying to figure out how to save KYOKA, but that didn't mean she wouldn't be doing the same. She'd proved to herself and her friend that she wasn't useless, that she could be a hero. She felt like she had to, really. Like Todoroki said, it was her fault Jiro got kidnapped. If there was one thing Momo always did, it was fix her mistakes. Start video log 3. You know, despite how good I am with technology, I admit that setting up cameras has always been tricky. A figure clad in a tattered mechanic's jumpsuit steps away from the camera lens, forming little L's with his fingers as he tries to gauge if it's angled correctly. Satisfied, he steps further back and the room is finally revealed. Plain, entirely made of concrete, with a rusted metal door directly in front of the camera. Directly in front of the door itself, however, is a rickety-looking folding chair, placed in the center of the room and ready to be sat upon. Putting its design to good use, the raggedy mechanic trudges over towards the seat and slams himself down upon it, his face now visible. It's adorned with a dirty, gray paint respirator and a similarly colored mining helmet, with its central lens cracked, sat upon his head. All right, take 2 on the video diary thing. Hopefully, this time, I actually remembered to hit the damn record button, so I won't have to do this again. With very little pomp, the figure smacked the helmet off his head and tore the mask away from his face before casually tossing it aside like a piece of garbage. His face, pale in complexion and utterly plain beyond matching sets of diamond-shaped freckles on his cheeks, looked partially annoyed and partially angry. The teen carted a hand through the now revealed fluffy viridian locks of hair atop his head, brushing several offending strands out of his emerald eyes. I had this really big speech planned, you know. Did a whole bit where I laid down some of my past left a couple clues, made vague remarks and all that before I did this whole identity reveal thing, but I really don't have the energy in me to do it a second time. His piece said. He threw his hands up in what was obviously a mocking imitation of celebration. So, here it is. Ta-da. Guess who? That's right, Jury Rig. I, 15-year-old Izuku Midoriya, am the villain Jury Rig. He spat, rolling his eyes immediately afterwards as though this was all some giant waste of effort. I bet no one from my old school will believe this when it hits the web. Well, guess what, esteemed classmates, you asked for this. You always told me, Izuku, you can't be a hero. You don't have a quirk. Be realistic. Well, surprise. After years and years of all you asshats beating me for the high crime of existing and having a dream, I decided to follow your advice. I met my idol, my big hero. And he told me the same thing all of you said. I'm man enough to admit it. You were right. I was wrong. It took me a bit. Had a final defiant moment where I tried to prove him wrong, work around his limitations, but eventually I took his advice to heart and realized I needed to wake up and smell the roses. The teen's face, which had previously been getting darker and darker as his spiel went on, took a sadistic turn as a predatory grin spread across it. I woke up all right. If I couldn't be a hero, well, no one said anything about becoming a villain. Hell, it was practically foreshadowed by my childhood, right Bakugo? He asked, the question clearly directed at a specific individual. When we were back in elementary school, right after you finally got your quirk and I didn't, you said I could no longer be the hero when we played heroes versus villains since heroes always had to have a cool quirk. Because I had none, that meant by default, I was always the villain. Always, and like all good heroes do, you made sure to really beat some sense into the villain, didn't you? The greenette stood up from the chair and moved beside it, before unexpectedly stepping up and placing a single foot upon the seat. Bending over, he reached down and yanked off the brown shoe upon his foot, and discarded the sock worn underneath it soon afterward. Seared into his flesh right around the ankle was the unmistakable red outline of a handprint, along with a splotchy, twisted mass of flesh clearly indicative of a burn scar. I still remember this, he motioned, gesturing towards the burn mark. I remember all of them, actually. My memory's always been pretty good, so it's not hard. I doubt you do, though. You probably can't even remember that grand speech you gave as you dragged me away, talking about how it was for my own good, and how villains like me deserve nothing less. His bare foot reared back and smashed into the side of the chair, sending it careening off camera and bashing into the far wall out of view. The villain bent down and started fiddling with what was likely his sock and shoe, even though his actions were out of frame and all that could still be seen of him was his hunched-over torso and wiggling arms. Despite this, he continued talking. That day was my 5th birthday party. By the way, you said it was my present actually, since normally you'd arrest villains in that game. You decided that beating me up and burning me in exchange for not arresting me was a decent present. Do you remember that cake I had? It was a chocolate cake with a lemon butter icing, and the yellow frosting was piped onto a tiny little all-might-shaped cookie my mother had made from our favorite bakery. Jury Rig finally stood back up and faced the camera, arms limply held at his sides. I never got to taste it, you know. You and your friends made sure to take it all and made me give you my piece. All the adults were busy talking in the corner, so no one ever saw it, and I never complained. Honestly, I probably shouldn't care. It's cake. I could have gone and bought another one. At the time, I actually didn't care because I was too naive to understand that you all were specifically working together to make sure I never got any. The man walks out of frame and comes back several moments later with the chair in tow, now with a noticeable dent in its backboard, likely from colliding with the concrete wall. He quickly set it back up in its original position, before again walking out of the camera's view. A terrible screeching noise sounded out, and a metallic folding table that had seen better days was slowly dragged on screen, the table's metal legs grinding against the unforgiving concrete floor, creating that terrible symphony. After depositing the table in front of the chair, he once more walked off screen but elected to provide a running commentary this time around. Birthdays 6, 7, and 8 all followed the same pattern. I'd show up, someone would beat me, break my presents, steal my food if y'all could get away with it when the parents were distracted, the usual hazing stuff. I finally got the message on birthday 9. And for that year and every year after that, I managed to convince my mother I was terribly sick and couldn't have a party. She'd always offered to have the party in a few days when I felt better, so I was forced to convince her I was a stickler for tradition. Told her I could only have parties on my actual birthday and refused anything but that. She always promised she'd take all the missed celebrations and pack it into next year's to make up for it. Izuku walked back on screen, holding a plain chocolate cake on a small plastic serving tray in one hand, with a white, plastic fork sticking out the top of it. Several pieces had already been eaten from the dessert, and with a single hand, the villain snagged the fork, scooped up another bite, and shoveled it into his mouth even as he set the tray upon the table. MMF, I never ate her makeup effort. He mumbled around his mouthful. again partially falling down into his seat. The teen dispassionately scooped up another bite and consumed it. Still chewing, he resumed his monologue. Never got cake at any of your parties either. When I was, invited to them. Really, only 2 of you invited me, Katsuki and you, Takamori, but that's just because our mothers talked, and they basically forced you to. Moral of the story, he paused, shoving another bite into his mouth. Haven't had a bite of cake since I was 5. 9 years of abstinence, all culminating in this moment here. Every bite I take, I remember it all. I think about everything I've missed out on. And every lie I told to stop anyone from getting into trouble because I held on to that foolish notion that we were friends. After taking another few bites, he rolled his eyes and gently placed the fork back into the top of the cake, flicking it idly with a finger once it was secure and watching it bob around. Want to know what I've learned from this experience? Without warning, Izuku reared back and slammed his hand onto the table, swiftly sliding it across the surface and sending the entire cake flying much like the chair earlier, a small, off-camera splat signifying its fate. Totally devoid of any emotion, the teen turned and stared listlessly into the camera, seemingly lost in his memories. I hate cake. 3 sharp knocks on the door was all the warning KYOKA was given before the villain who'd kidnapped her barged into the RV, pizza box in hand. Unfortunately for him, she'd been doing her level best to fight off the adrenaline crash she'd been going through, struggling to keep her eyes open. At that moment, she'd been attempting to stay awake through the use of her TV. What all this meant was that she had a remote control in her hand which, despite being handcuffed, she managed to hurl at her kidnapper. Bright green eyes widened and he, in a display of impressive reaction speed yet questionable judgment, immediately threw himself back out the still open door, crashing onto the ground with a noticeable thud. The remote, once on a collision course with his face, flew through the now clear doorway and clattered onto the warehouse's concrete flooring. While she couldn't see him from her current position, she did hear him groan and shuffle around, before there was a slight pause and a soft "oh" reached her ears. Several seconds later, the villain's unmasked, unsmiling visage stepped back in through the door, clutching the now scuffed remote in one hand and a slightly crumpled pizza box. Almost sheepishly, she opened her mouth to spit out an apology before remembering that he was a villain and not some random teen, and as such, didn't deserve one. She settled for clicking her jaw shut and pointedly looking away from his less than amused glare. Good throw, he may be complimented. Walking further into the RV and haphazardly chucking the scuffed remote onto the sofa as he paced by. Spot on aim, actually. Probably could have done real damage if it had been heavy enough. Practice with throwing knives or something. Almost curiously, her gaze followed the greenette as he went to the kitchenette, placing the pizza box on the counter before rummaging around in a drawer for something. Moments later, he withdrew a paper plate. Maybe, she curtly responded, not exactly desiring to start any form of conversation with the teen. She actually had been a rather avid knife thrower a couple years back, something she picked up accidentally while hanging out with Kaminari. The knife throwing was his hobby, but the electric blonde sucked so bad KYOKA taught herself the skill just to try and help him. As with most things though, his attention span ran out shortly thereafter and Jiro was stuck with what she considered a mostly useless skill. Turns out though, knife throwing directly translated to remote tossing. She'd make a great angry drunk, at any rate. Her captor made a grunt of acknowledgement and set about opening the box, questioning her once more. Hope you don't mind mushrooms and onions on your pizza. Boss's orders. A few hours ago, she'd be grilling him on what he meant by boss. Now though, she had a pretty good inkling on the boss's identity. After all, her own father often referred to KYOKA as such, especially in her younger years when she had even less of a filter. By boss, you mean your daughter. Some sort of emotion flickered on the teen's face, and for the life of her, Jiro genuinely couldn't decipher it. He recovered quickly though, an indifferent mask thrown atop his features as he used a plastic fork and knife to pick up a slice from the box and deposited it upon the plate. Almost begrudgingly, he answered, "Well, yes, I'd like to. Well, let's just say I'm sorry." Jiro cocked an eyebrow at him and attempted to fold her arms, but the magnetically locked cuffs prevented it. She settled for snapping at him. For the leg. Oh, for the kidnapping, right. No, hurting my friend, maybe. Attacking UA in general. Being born. You'll have to make your apologies a bit more specific, I'm afraid. Much to her own frustration, her tirade made him frown for less than a fraction of a second before it turned into a lopsided grin. I was referring to my boss's earlier comments. She's a bit, naive about how relationships work. Gee, I wonder why. She deadpanned at him, only to receive a roll of his eyes in return. All right, you're not exactly wrong, but I think it's pretty obvious she's adopted. I'm doing my best here. First off, she started, raising her cuffed wrists and holding up a single finger. You're a villain. Villains shouldn't be taking care of kids. Second, another finger raised. Your quirk obviously isn't some youthful features crap. Which means unless you've got freakishly good genes or you're, 16 at most. I don't think I need to explain why that's not an appropriate age for raising kids. For some unfathomable reason, something she said got a rise out of him. If the greenette freezing and taking a deep breath before attempting to talk again was any indication. 14. Actually, he eventually corrected, much to KYOKA's own mild surprise. As for your other points, yeah, I got nothing, he admitted with a shrug. As a villain though, it's not like I exactly care about the law, right? While he may have had a point there, that didn't make it right. With a shrug of his own, the greenette grabbed the plate and carried it over to the couch she'd yet to get off of, depositing it on the armrest nearest her. Just try your best not to stress out. My fight's with you, not you. You were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. As a student, I'm pretty sure I was exactly where I was supposed to be, she retorted, narrowing her eyes at the man. Again, villain. Logic doesn't apply to my actions, he countered, crossing his arms and adopting a cocky, self-assured grin. She wanted nothing more than to bruise those freckles on his cheeks while she caved his pearly white teeth in with her fists. The pair of them engaged in a stare-off of sorts, before, with an embarrassed cough, the teen realized KYOKA had no intention of continuing the conversation. Quite awkwardly, he attempted to strike it up again. All right, well, just a few questions and I'll leave you alone. Firstly, I'm gonna try and grab you a pair of crutches so you can move around your RV. Ever used those before? Again, KYOKA elected not to speak, continuing to glare at him instead. Okay, medication. Any allergies I need to be aware of? Need pills, inhalers, insulin, vitamins, some sort of special equipment necessitated by your quirk like earplugs. This time, the awkward silence stretched on for quite a lot longer and KYOKA realized he might have been serious about the whole. Racked her brain for a few seconds trying to think of something that would help her escape, but couldn't think of anything beyond Trigger, which, while he probably had access to, she doubted he'd retrieve for her. Also, she had no interest in doing Trigger either. Reluctantly, she finally replied, "No medicine needed," she sighed, rolling her eyes and looking away from her strange kidnapper. The teen clapped his hands. Excellent. Just as quickly as he'd barged in, the greenette turned on his heels and made to exit the RV. I'll be back later if I can find those crutches. Try not to take my head off when I come in next time, all right? Maybe don't barge in uninvited. It's my RV. I can come in whenever I want. Again, just because he had a point didn't make it right. Closing the door behind him, Izuku walked several paces away before letting out a sigh. Yet again, the things he sought continued to elude him. He just didn't get it. He'd talked to Shigaraki about it. He looked it up online. He discussed the phenomena in chat rooms and grabbed first-hand perspectives on the subject. By all accounts, he was doing exactly what everyone else was, and yet he never felt what they so obviously did. Whenever he got bullied, it was obvious his tormentors enjoyed it. They smiled, they sneered, they laughed, all of it. Villains did the same things, too. He'd seen it on TV as they taunted the heroes they fought, the superior smirks and holier-than-thou attitudes. So why do I just feel guilty? Being a jerk's supposed to feel good. That's not to say he always felt bad. Back at the USJ, that rush he got when he successfully flew out of the USJ without interference was amazing. And he had a feeling he'd get that same rush when this was all said and done. Still, it was in these moments between the action, as he planned and waited to make his next move, that the guilt he harbored seemed to crawl out from his innermost depths to torment him. He was fairly certain these reactions were unique to him, or at least not very widespread. There was no way his old school bullies felt guilty about what they did. Otherwise they wouldn't have done it every single day. Halfway there, just a bit longer and you can stop, he mumbled to himself, marching back towards the RV he and Eri shared. Even as he repeated that little mantra to himself, the urge to simply give up reared its ugly head again. Fatherhood was not something Izuku ever gave much thought to. In complete honesty, whenever he did think about it, he was usually depressed because his diagnosis as quirkless was a pretty undesirable trait to have nowadays, especially 4 generations since the rise of quirks. Anyone who had a kid with him would basically be throwing a wrench into their child's genes. Now that he'd adopted the role of Eri's father, however, he thought he understood the parental mindset, that feeling inside you, urging oneself to do anything to make your child happy, to provide for them. He never thought he'd fall victim to those feelings. But then again, Izuku never figured he'd be a villain either. Life had a funny way of working out. He couldn't give up villainy, no. Eri needed protection, and he couldn't do that as a civilian. For several reasons, he could never do that. If he tried to go back to civilian life, not only would he have to deal with the League seeking revenge upon him, but he'd be stuck in multiple levels of legal trouble. Technically, he wasn't a villain. He'd never used a quirk in his crime, and, considering he was still 14, courts would be hard-pressed to charge him as an adult. He'd be in trouble all right, but probably nothing more severe than juvie and whatever community service, counseling crap they'd make him attend. The real issue is what they'd do to Eri. They'd take the girl to have a full medical checkup as per standard procedure. Her quirk would be discovered and then consequently reported to the National Registry. That was just asking for the Hero Commission to come kidnap her. One of the few things he'd actually learned from his time spent with Shigaraki. Hero society wasn't as idealistic as he'd always pictured it. It wasn't the flaming trash heap Tamura described it as either, but it still wasn't a field of roses. The people in charge of the Hero Commission were little better than white-collar criminals. Businessmen and women only in it for the money and prestige. Their little program of acquiring gifted younglings and raising them to be heroes was little better than indentured servitude. Sure, they'd technically be free to do whatever they want, but they'd have a childhood filled with nothing but biased education shoved inside their heads and lifetime contracts that basically said we own you in big black font. Like their latest success story, Hawks. Sure, he could cancel his contract with the commission anytime he wanted, but the house he lived in would be taken away, and all his bank accounts would deny him access. He could leave, but he'd have to start life from scratch, all while dodging around whatever political maneuvering the commission did to make his life after them as miserable as possible. That was not a fate he'd allow Eri to suffer. She'd already been through enough. Izuku was going to raise her just fine, and when she was finally an adult and the commission couldn't touch her in any way, shape, or form, she'd finally have a chance to be whatever she wanted. It would be all too easy to abandon this revenge quest against All Might and devote his efforts towards more lucrative ventures that would allow him to facilitate a permanent escape. So far, efforts on his part to create a nest egg in case he needed to run away had failed spectacularly, as he was basically living paycheck to paycheck. He could just abandon his crusade and focus on robbing banks or something. Smashing into armored cars wouldn't be too big of a hassle with a few specialized drones. And he could probably make a machine to sort through the stacks of cash and rip out the die packs and GPS trackers. Possibly out of sheer stubbornness, though, he didn't want to. Izuku refused to be a failure at this. He might have failed at being a hero, but he wasn't going to do the same as a villain. He had to succeed, had to prove to himself and All Might that he could do something important, something big. With a shake of his head, the Greenette banished all those thoughts from his mind and silently plodded over to his and Eri's RV on the other side of the warehouse in silence. His RV wasn't just parked out in the middle of the warehouse for all to see. Rather, he'd hidden it behind a stack of long-abandoned shipping crates piled into the northeast corner of his warehouse. Well, perhaps hidden was a poor term for it. Really, it just wasn't immediately visible to anyone who barged in. Passing through a slightly corroded blue crate, he came out the other side to find his RV where he left it, lights inside still on. Through the cloth curtains, he could see a small shadow occasionally flitter about inside, pacing the length of the RV over and over again. A strange feeling welled up in Izuku upon witnessing that. It was unusual, seeing his surrogate daughter adopt his mannerisms. He himself had picked up the habit of pacing from Shigaraki by accident, and as such, he wasn't entirely sure how he felt about Eri emulating that behavior. Still, it was better than mumbling. "Eri, I'm back," he called out upon reaching the door, before opening it slowly. Past experiences taught him that she didn't particularly enjoy sudden intrusions without knowing who was coming in. Izuku would be lying if he didn't understand a bit of that fear as well. Overhaul had a habit of just slamming open doors and coming inside to do whatever he wanted without preamble. Soon after he'd stepped over the door's threshold, a white blur collided with his midsection and two tiny arms wrapped around his waist. Bending down as much as he could, he wrapped his own arms around the little girl as well. "You're back. Did you visit Mama? Is she gonna have dinner with us?" Again, against his better judgment, Izuku couldn't bring himself to totally crush the young girl's hopes. "I will. Not tonight, sweetie. Mama needs some time to settle in, you know." The horned girl frowned a bit, but otherwise didn't comment. Gently, Izuku disentangled her limbs from his waist and pushed her towards their miniature dining room. As she made her way over, Midoriya himself entered their kitchenette and focused on the two large pizza boxes he'd placed there earlier. Just as with his guest earlier, paper plates were quickly withdrawn from the cupboards and set upon the countertop, and Izuku began portioning out the slices. "Ooh, and namaste." As usual, the Greenette couldn't help but crack a smile at his little unicorn. "I'm still going to cut your pizza for you if you don't take small bites this time. There will be no choking in this house." The white-haired girl pouted, sticking out her bottom lip as she gripped the hem of her shirt. It transformed into a smile when he dropped a paper plate loaded with 2 slices of her mushroom and onion pizza onto the table in front of her, though. "By the way," he began, loading up his own dish. "Nama's a Hindu thing, not Japanese. You don't have to say it here." Hearing no response, he glanced over to the table, only to roll his eyes as Eri attempted to shove an entire slice into her mouth at once. A few mushrooms jumped ship and smacked lifelessly onto the plate below. Only once she'd succeeded in cramming half the slice into her mouth did her red-eyed gaze connect with Izuku's, and she sheepishly withdrew most of it to take a more acceptably sized bite. In this case, that meant a third of the pizza instead of half. He was very tempted to take her plate, follow through on his threat of cutting her slices, but ultimately elected to wait until she inevitably came back for seconds. While she wasn't related to Izuku through blood, she did happen to share a defining Midoriya family trait: surprisingly large appetites for their size. She could and would easily inhale a large pizza if given the opportunity. Left alone for a day, she could probably wolf down 3. Thankfully, she wasn't a very picky eater and tended to like anything he fed her. Getting her to eat veggies wasn't a problem whatsoever. In another stroke of what was probably luck, the girl loved her fruits and preferred those as snacks instead of junk foods like chips. Really, her only vice seemed to be candy. The sweet tooth on that girl was unparalleled, and so far, that had been the only thing he'd ever had to put his foot down, as it were, with his surrogate daughter. Because as much as she might want to, she could not, in fact, have candy for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Izuku closed the pizza box and left it on the counter, grabbing his own plate and making his way over towards their tiny dining room table. The wooden furniture was advertised to fit 4, but was really meant for just 2 people, 3 at the absolute most. Idly taking a much more reasonably sized bite of pizza, Izuku grabbed the nearby TV remote and flipped it on, staring at the screen he'd set up a few meters away in their living room. Flipping through the channels, he quickly switched to the Hero News Network and settled down into his chair. Still hasn't released many details despite multiple requests, citing ongoing investigations as the reason for secrecy. Despite this, many have speculated that UA was assaulted by a large group of villains, though the perpetrators are currently unknown. Principal Nezu has promised to give a press as soon as humanly possible. His eyes narrowed at the television as the female newscaster continued blathering on. Soon as possible? What's with that? Midoriya had not anticipated this. No one had died. Well, he didn't think anyone had died. Besides, if someone did die, that information definitely would have spilled over. They were trying to keep a lid on something. But what? The only thing he could think of that was Madara. Would Shigaraki loudly boast to everyone about how he knew of All Might's weakness? Alright, maybe it wasn't that difficult to figure out what they were trying to keep a lid on. All Might was injured. That was painfully obvious when he escaped. They were trying to figure out how to spin the story to make an event that resulted in All Might getting injured seem as minor as possible. The greenette muffled his sigh of disappointment by shoving pizza crust into his mouth. Before he could do much more, though, a little ding interrupted his musings. Reaching into his pants pocket, he pulled out his phone and stared at the cracked screen, eyes widening slightly in surprise. One of the last people he expected to talk with him had sent a message. "Kurajiri, Sensei has inquired about your well-being. He's requested you come by for an examination by the doctor after the USJ fight. You have his word you shall not be harmed. I shall open a portal at the usual spot." Papa, the greenette's eyes jerked up from his screen, and, belatedly, he realized he'd probably been staring at it with an open mouth. While he always figured the doctor wouldn't care that he ditched Tamura at the USJ considering his obvious dislike of the man-child, he certainly never expected that All For One would apparently feel the same way. He didn't think he'd anger the quirk-stealing man either, but All For One was content to let Tamura lead the league and fulfilled his every request whenever possible, even if it was stupid. In doing so, he supposed that was teaching Tamura about the responsibilities of being a leader, how even his best-laid plans could fail. Without a shred of doubt in his mind, he knew Tamura had already demanded he be blacklisted from the league. Until about 15 seconds ago, however, he was also 100% certain All For One had shrugged and agreed to it. Seems the man's odd interest in Izuku paid off. Flicking his jaw, Midoriya addressed the curious stare of his daughter. Sorry, Eri. I'm gonna need to go for a bit. It seems I have an unscheduled doctor's appointment to attend." She winced, averting her eyes from his own and staring at the floor. "Why, you're not gonna bring back any more needles, are you?" Izuku sighed. "Not for you, Eri. Just me." Needles were one of the things his unicorn despised with a passion. Sadly, the greenette wasn't going to let her live with him in this warehouse filled with rusty metal without taking precaution. He'd paid the doctor to steal a full set of vaccines, and administered them to Eri about a month back. Tetanus was not an enemy he had any desire to fight, even if it made Eri flinch away from him when he discussed medicines. Standing up from his seat, Izuku grabbed the last slice on his plate and made his way towards the RV's door, sparing a glance back at the unicorn. "I'll be back soon, I promise. No overnight trips this time. This should only take an hour at most." She nodded, but didn't verbally acknowledge him. He couldn't say that action didn't hurt him a tiny bit. "Eri, I'm gonna trust you to be responsible here. Please, don't visit our guest, all right? She just wants to eat her dinner in peace right now." She managed a half-hearted MMHM this time around, and, with a sigh, the greenette exited his RV. His footsteps carried him across the cracked concrete flooring, heading for the warehouse exit. While annoying, there was no way in hell he'd ever reveal the coordinates of his actual base to anyone in the league. So what if he had to take a 15-minute taxi to get to his designated spot? Nimuri Kayama, aka Midnight, was normally one to engage in the practice known as sashing, sometimes dabbled in the art of sauntering and would, on occasion, flounce. With her image as the R-rated heroine, she'd quite literally conditioned herself to sway her hips whenever she walked anywhere, simply to keep up appearances. It took barely any effort on her part to perform the act nowadays. Today, however, even the minuscule amount of mental exertion she required to flaunt her goods was too taxing for her mind to handle, so instead of seductively swaying her way down UAS halls, she was instead speed walking. She wasn't even doing a light sprint to force her breasts to bounce around. With a groan as the phone in her jeans buzzed, Kayama reluctantly picked up the pace. Midnight was none too pleased by her newly appointed duties, nor the constant messaging her phone received as a result of them. With Aizawa put up for the foreseeable future thanks to his injuries, it fell upon Midnight to become Nezu's go-to for information. Why was debatable. Perhaps it was simply that out of all UAS staff, her schedule remained the lightest in terms of workload. What with everyone else's being shuffled around to deal with maintaining order at the school, media distraction duties, investigative efforts, etc. Perhaps the rat just liked seeing Kayama flounder about while trying to do a fairly simple task. Either way, she got the job. Aizawa had it previously because his no-nonsense, tell me what I want to know 3 seconds ago attitude was great for both receiving, acquiring, and then relaying information expediently, in both senses of the word. None of those were skills Midnight claimed to be particularly good at. Still, she was stuck with it, so she'd do the best she could. Plus Ultra, right. Nezu should just cave in and download the Cacophony app already. The group text set up for the staff members was slow, and not nearly as user-friendly as the chatting app. That old-fashioned rat refused, though. Maybe he really did just like watching UAS staff run around like mice in a maze across UAS campus through his damned security cameras. In either case, her new duties decreed that she had to grab information and report it to any interested parties. In this case, that meant all involved parties. Nezu himself, other teachers, cops, lawyers, the whole shebang. For probably the millionth time in her life, Midnight mentally thanked the workshop that custom made her cushion high heels. If she had to waltz around in regular heels, she probably would have keeled over by now. First up on her dossier for today was the support workshop. As part of their efforts to determine who kidnapped their student, UA claimed the wrecks of the drones as the USJ as their own, and Six their resident mechanic on the job. It was his responsibility to rip what was left of them apart, put it back together, and figure out any secrets the contraptions may have held. All she had to do was parse through the support course teacher's tech speak. As she rounded another corner, the development studio sign hanging in the distance at the end of the hallway, she was forced to suppress a shudder. If Higari mentioned anything about the coffee machine, she'd be giving him a piece of her mind. And probably a whipping too. Not the fun kind of whipping, either. Huffing, the woman closed the remaining distance between her and UAS powder keg, sliding open the huge, reinforced metal door, quickly traipsing over to Powerloader, who was hunched over his desk staring at the desiccated remains of the mechanical drones recovered from the USJ. As she made her way over, his eyes spared her a momentary glance and he grunted in acknowledgement of her presence. Even if she couldn't summon the will to saunter, she still had the presence of mind to summon a teasing smirk to her face, cockily resting a hand on her hips as she came to a stop in front of his station. "Ah, Higari," she leered. "Is that any way to greet your beloved coworker? I like my men to have a little more energy, you know. I may have a pill for that if you need a pick-me-up." "Oh, I need a pick-me-up. All right," the man grouched, standing up and popping his spine as he did so. Too bad someone mangled the coffee machine. Nimuri managed to keep the smirk on her face, though her right eye definitely twitched once or twice. Blowing air through her nose, she shrugged and leaned over the support course teacher's desk, readily invading the man's personal space. "Sticks and stones, my friend. Why don't we get down to business, HRM?" she asked with narrowed eyes, clearly not sensing the danger he was in. Higari shrugged and gestured to the dusty, disfigured remains of machinery on his desk. "This is both literal garbage and a masterpiece of engineering." Kayama raised her eyebrow in surprise. She expected a long-winded, techie explanation full of words she couldn't even begin to understand. Perhaps this would be easier than she thought. "Coming from you, that's high praise. Really though, a masterpiece." The lithe engineer shrugged slightly and hunched back over his workstation, once again picking over the parts of the salvaged camera bot. "All right, masterpiece was a bit of alliteration on my part, but the point stands. This thing is genuinely hideous, but it's surprisingly well built at the same time. Well, sort of. These wires here." He gestured, pointing to several exposed and horrendously frayed wires sticking out one half of the device's sole remaining propeller blade. "Totally useless. They're connected to what I think is the main power source, but then they're not hooked up to anything else. It's like someone started wiring it, left for an hour and forgot it, then came back and installed functional wiring elsewhere. I'd almost say it was done for aesthetics, but again, it's hooked up to the main power source. They're live wires. The man perked up, as if remembering something. Oh yeah, check this out, too, he exclaimed, before suddenly flipping the device over in a not-so-gentle manner, causing a large spray of dust to fly out of the half-decayed contraption. Now that the device was flipped over, though, Midnight could see Powerloader's metal fingertips pointing at what appeared to be large, rusty metal spears with prongs jutting out the sides at perpendicular angles stabbed through the machine's chassis, 3 of them to be exact. The support course teacher looked expectantly at Kayama. Mind spelling it out for me? She half-pleaded, flashing the man a winning smile. He deadpanned. Oh, come on. Surely you know what these are. I know you're not great with technology considering what you did to the staff's coffee machine. But really, all the more reason you should just explain it. Slowly, she shot back, her mood souring just from the mention of the break room's accursed machine. He should know better than to mention that blunder. The man sighed dramatically, as though he'd suffered a great personal loss. Ugh, fine. They're TV antennas, and rather ancient ones at that. Like 2052 at the absolute latest. Best guess. They receive and transmit signals from this thingy here. Again he gestured to what at one point might have been a large video camera, though it looked as though someone ripped the casing off of it and splayed the internals as far apart as physically possible in some ghastly, graphic, technologically gory display. Dirty, corroded circuit boards and exposed wiring were literally everywhere, half of it stuck together with twist ties and what looked like hot glue. What appeared to be wooden popsicle sticks were used as rudimentary support beams to keep several components from touching one another. I don't know if this thing actually recorded footage and sent it anywhere or not, but I can tell you this. Whoever this villain is, he's likely responsible for the signal jamming that happened at the USJ. Again, Midnight's eyebrow arched. Really? What makes you say that? The villain's quirk may be responsible for controlling those drones, but I doubt he's got the capability of seeing through the lens of a camera too. He wouldn't have installed these antennas if he didn't need his robots to send and receive signals. As such, he would have had to know a specific way to counter or get around the signal scrambling, which meant they either assisted in or were entirely responsible for said jamming. He readily replied, shrugging a bit. Kayama sighed, rubbing her temple in frustration at the man's confident proclamation. The more I learn about this guy, the more confused I get. Her colleague nodded sympathetically. Tell me about it. This drone gives me a headache just looking at it. Again, it's garbage, and I'm not entirely sure how it even flies, let alone how that camera worked. But at the same time, it does function, and based on what happened at the USJ, they function rather well. The R-rated heroine raised her hand up to her chin in thought. One of her colleagues' earlier remarks had piqued her interest. Actually, Higari, back up a second. You said the guy's quirk controls these things. How'd you figure that? He shrugged. Only thing I can think of, really. Again, I don't see how it functions. If we got an intact one, maybe I'd be able to discern more. As it is, we have literal scraps of the one that attacked Aizawa, which had an explosive inside it for some reason, and this one's half dust and clearly got thrown around a lot. Simply judging by the components used in its construction, I'd say the device can't function on its own, and the guy's supplementing his subpar mechanical knowledge with a quirk. It's possible I'm wrong, but unless you can grab hold of a drone that hasn't been horrendously mangled so I can dissect it and check what its internals look like when it's normal, that'll be the best opinion I can provide. So, basically, the thing's too damaged for you to provide us much of an answer, she summarized. The man nodded in agreement. Yep, again, everything in this particular drone looks like seventh-hand stuff. Like, I dug this out of a hole in the ground and repurposed it levels of tech here. I may have recovered a single fragment of a high-tech, military-grade circuit board from the exploded drone, but I can't definitively say for sure if that's true. It's entirely possible anything I'd recognize as functional tech got disintegrated here, he claimed, pointing to the missing half of the drone and the pile of ash now littering his workstation. Nezu won't be too happy to hear that. Powerloader shrugged again. Hey, I'm not particularly happy either. This drone's the equivalent of someone turning in a doctoral-level thesis on advanced nuclear physics, but it's written entirely with crayon and the handwriting's barely legible. The woman squinted. What kind of an analogy is that? When I put about as much effort into making as you put into changing the coffee machine's filters. Elsewhere in UA, Aizawa's bandaged visage cracked a thin smile. For a part of his brain distinctly trained to recognize suffering registered the sound of one of his colleagues being smacked. Welcome, jury rig, Kurigiri's unnervingly smooth, disembodied voice echoed around the room, hardly distracting Izuku as his eyes rapidly scanned the room. He'd stepped through the portal and one exit, a single door, flimsy looking, probably plywood, easy enough to kick down. Room's small, no noticeable hiding spots beyond the cupboards, highly unlikely that Shigaraki's inside. Karaki will be by soon. Please, make yourself comfortable, the misty bartender droned, before the speaker or whatever he was using to project his voice into the room turned off, as did the portal Izuku stepped through. Actually, what if there aren't any speakers? That mist is part of Kurogiri's body. Maybe he can project his voice through the portals themselves. Could he open a tiny portal inside a cupboard and use it to listen in on conversations? Or to speak through? Does the size of the portal affect his volume? Could it be thaw? A low chortling distracted Izuku from his thoughts, and his head whirled around to the doorway. I see you've still got that mumbling habit, Midoriya. Though, you are getting better at it. An ancient, familiar, and utterly despised voice called out, causing Izuku to scowl slightly. Even though he knew he'd be dealing with the doctor when he got that text, that didn't mean he had to like it. At the very least, he hadn't opened the door without permission. Barging in on Izuku unexpectedly was a good way to get something thrown at you. Alright, maybe he didn't have the right to be angry at his guest now that he thought about it more. Come in, Izuku sighed, standing back from the door and hopping up on the cheap, mass-produced examination bed shoved into the corner. It was your standard doctor's room, something you'd see in a typical middle-class office. Small, barely larger than a bathroom. Walls painted a dull blue, an examination table taking up 3 divided by 4ths of the entire back wall, a cabinet with a sink built into it, and a red, plastic tub for disposing used needles. There was a small flat-screen TV embedded within the wall, as was standard for all League-affiliated hideouts. All for one loved to listen in. The doctor stepped into the room soon after, and again, Izuku fought off the scowl at seeing his former pediatrician once more. The man he once knew as Dr. Tsubasa, but now only recognized as Dr. Kyudai Garaki, all for one's personal physician. The man was short, bald, chubby, had a gigantic, unkempt mustache that prominently stood out on his face, as did the pair of unusual goggles he wore in place of glasses. He looked exactly as he had 10 years ago, but with a life-extending quirk like he had, Izuku supposed that was normal. After all, he was apparently well over 100 years old, despite looking somewhere around 60. Ah, Midoriya, still haven't given up, I see. He smiled, the action causing his face to wrinkle into dimples that would fit perfectly on a kindly grandfather. You should probably give it up. Your child can't be a hero without a quirk. It made the greenette's stomach curl in disgust. Yeah, well, you still ain't dead, so I guess we're both defying nature, huh? I suppose we're both disappointments in that regard, Garaki smirked. Come now, since you're here we might as well do a physical checkup. You know the drill. Izuku rolled his eyes but wordlessly complied, sighing as he stripped the jumpsuit off his torso. As the fabric fell from his shoulders, the boy's torso, absolutely riddled with scars, came into view. Just below his left collarbone, the skin of which looked as though it had been set aflame at some point, were the remnants of a large, grisly puncture wound. The teen's backside has a similar scarred-over perforation at roughly the same height, also covered in burned flesh. Right shoulder first, Kyudai mumbled, moving forward to run his hands along the boy's contracture scars. Midoriya grit his teeth in discomfort more than pain, allowing his flesh to be poked and prodded by the physician. Pain is still minimal. How's your mobility doing in the arm, HRM? It seems our treatment has grown your missing muscles back nicely. Reluctantly, Izuku nodded. Mobility's pretty good. Not many issues in that regard. If I reach too far I can feel my skin pulling itself sometimes, but that's about it. Pains, manageable. I think most of it's just in my head. Garaki turned to quickly jot down a note of some kind on the little pad he kept in his pocket, grumbling something under his breath. Good, good. If you keep stretching you should get used to the tightness of your skin. That's simply a side effect of your scarring. Nothing to be too concerned over unless it's a detriment to your mobility. Might as well refill your painkillers while you're here, too, I suppose. They have been helping, right? The greenette mumbled and shoved his hand inside his pocket, withdrawing an empty orange bottle from its depths. The doctor raised an eyebrow at the teen and took the vial, scrutinizing it from behind his goggles. Do try and restrain yourself next time. I'd rather not be responsible for creating another drug addict, the doctor griped, placing the empty vial in his pocket for later. Midoriya mumbled a few select words under his breath and shrugged noncommittally to rein in his growing frustration, prompting a sigh from the man. My dear boy. Izuku swallowed his anger and instantly sat at attention. Garaki followed suit, but he did it more out of respect than fear. The damn monitor set up in the corner of the examination room had flickered to life, its annoyingly bright no-picture text blaring in all its red-colored glory center screen. Your health is very important, Midoriya. You should follow the good doctor's advice, he rumbled, voice craggly yet silky smooth at the same time. Thank you, Sensei. The doctor smiled in appreciation, directing a small nod towards the TV screen. Despite not knowing if the man could actually see it, Midoriya trained a small glare on the screen. And why, exactly, do you care so much? You're always chiming in on my exams like this, so what's the big deal, eh? Get some kinda rush from seeing the mess you've made. Hyuda had turned around and seemed to be studying the greenette with a curious expression. While the TV gave away no indicators, he had the distinct feeling All for One had cocked an eyebrow at his declaration as well. "Oh, the mess I have made. Whatever do you mean, Izuku?" "Shut up," he hissed, gripping the table he sat upon with all his worth. "You do not get to call me by name. I'm not some brain-drained slave like Shigaraki you can manipulate. What, do you think I'm stupid? I know exactly what you did." To his own consternation, his angry outburst only seemed to amuse the man behind the screen. "Oh ho, seems you do have a bit of your father in you after all. There's that fire. Please, do go on. What, you want me to spell it out for you? It's obvious," Izuku shrieked, gesturing wildly at the mildly amused, rotund doctor in the room with him. It's Tsubasa, my pediatrician, the one I saw exactly 3 times for quirk examinations, and then never again. Need I spell it out any further? HRM, the doctor grumbled. "I'd honestly thought you'd forgotten about that, to be honest. Like I'd forget the worst day of my life, Garaki. No, I know what happened. I did have a quirk. I had telekinesis, and you told All for One and had him steal it. Just like you've done to countless others, I'd bet. You," Izuku turned back to the TV screen, "are just here to laugh at the villain you inadvertently created. That's why you're so damn interested in me. I'm a cosmic joke to you. The quirk What, you think he stole?" Karaki's rambling question. Word vomit was cut off by a low chortle coming across the monitor, the sound comparable to grating rocks together. "Is that the conclusion you've come to? What other conclusion am I supposed to come to?" Izuku spat. "Every damn time you offer me a quirk, it's telekinesis this, telekinesis that. Hell, you offered me fire breathing once, so you obviously know all the quirks my family has. You just think it's so hilarious that stealing my quirk made me a villain, don't you?" Midoriya clicked his mouth shut and focused on breathing through his nose, a technique he'd mastered to stop himself from shouting or crying out long ago. His glare continuously shifting between Garaki and the monitor, Izuku awaited a response of any kind. His eyes only narrowed further when he noticed Garaki was smiling at him like he was a gift-wrapped present. Another chuckle sounded out from the television screen, followed by a slight cough. "Well, when you lay it out like that I can certainly see your point of view. You aren't wrong about how my good doctor assisted me in acquiring quirks. However, you have my word I have never stolen a quirk from you, Midoriya." Like a balloon allowed to release all its air, Midoriya deflated, his expression turning undeniably confused. All for One didn't generally lie, in his experience. It's not that Izuku didn't think he wouldn't, but rather the man had no need to do so unless it provided him with a tangible benefit. As far as he could discern, lying in this situation provided nothing beyond possible amusement to the crippled villain. "Heh. So close yet so far away, my boy. So close. Have no fear. All will be revealed eventually." Before Izuku could interrogate the man, a crash from several floors below, followed by the muffled sound of barely comprehensible screeching, distracted all 3 of the room's occupants. The monitor released a weary, bone-deep sigh. "It appears that Tamura has been besieged by Noob Master 69 yet again. I must attend to my other charge before he dusts his console. Again, farewell for now, Midoriya, and remember to take care of yourself. After all, who will watch over Eri if you're not around?" Midoriya growled as the screen cut off its audio feed, leaving him to stew in his thoughts with the still grinning Garaki. Sensei loved to taunt Izuku with the girl he'd been living with. It was obvious he knew Midoriya cared deeply for the girl, far more than he'd ever admit to. If he could have lied about her existence, he would have. Sadly, he needed Garaki's help in nursing her back to health and was forced to talk about her in order to get the necessary medicines to ensure a speedy recovery. All he was able to truly do was hide the nature of her quirk. And even then the Greenette knew All for One probably had his suspicions about that. The only reason Izuku wouldn't let Garaki examine her in person would be to hide the child's power. After all, he was trapped between a rock and a hard place and he couldn't see a way out. All he could do was vent his frustrations on others, or in this case, All Might. He'd worry about All for One later. Maybe I'm going about this all wrong. I'll never be able to fight All Might, but All for One could. Perhaps the solution to both his problems was staring him in the face, after all. Start video log 4. The screen crackles to life and after a flash of static, Izuku Midoriya is seen once more in the plain concrete room from the previous video, sitting in a visibly dented folding chair. The folding table from before had been set up in front of him, an aged cardboard box rested upon it. He was digging around inside it with a slight scowl on his face, arm deep in the box. The Greenette inclined his head towards the camera. "You have no idea how nerve-wracking it was to get this thing." The scowl on his face became slightly puzzled, and he proceeded to pull out a broken action figure of what might have been All Might. Its entire head and half its torso melted into a strange, blackened goop with streaks of red and blue. "I completely forgot this existed. Just another thing I failed to fix, I guess." The scowl on his face became more pronounced and he reared back as if to throw the doll. before deflating and simply letting it fall from his hand onto the floor below with a sigh. That done, he proceeded to continue digging around inside the box. This box, he started, steadily pulling out what looked like old clothing and unceremoniously dropping them on the table, is something I've recovered from my old room. Now, most teens hide things like saucy magazines or condoms deep inside their closet so their parents don't find them, you know. With a grunt of exertion, the entire box was then lifted up and hastily tipped over, its contents tumbling out onto the table. What appeared to be several dozen empty tubes of toothpaste and smaller boxes of various colors, more crumpled clothes, the mangled remains of a textbook, and 2 first aid kits clattered around on the metallic surface. I hid this stuff instead," he triumphantly proclaimed, spreading his arms wide as though he was a shopkeep at the bazaar hawking his wares. Grabbing one of the many empty tubes of toothpaste, Izuku held it up to the camera in the palm of his hand. The camera blurred for a moment as it focused in on the new object, but soon the slightly faded words of burn cream could be visible upon its label. Burn cream, for all the, well, explosions, you know. He stumbled, searching around the dumped contents, before snagging one of the many multicolored boxes, tossing each one aside and picking up a new one as he named them. Medicated gauze, butterfly bandages for when I got some really deep cuts, antiseptic wipes. I think you get the gist of it. Oh, I remember this one, he exclaimed, turning to the wrinkled bunches of fabric scattered across the table. With an exaggerated flourish, one of the white lumps was snatched up and unfolded before the camera. It was a very simple t-shirt, in all honesty, entirely white, with the kanji for clothing written upon the chest in bold, black font. Besides being very wrinkled and rather small, obviously for a much younger version of himself, there was absolutely nothing noteworthy about the fabric. Another exaggerated flourish. Izuku turned the shirt around and immediately, its importance became clear. Just below the bottom right of its collar, the shirt was missing a large swath of fabric, and the torn-off edges appeared to be singed, the cloth taking on a slightly blackish-orange tinge around the obviously burnt edges. Flinging the article of clothing aside, Midoriya proceeded to grab a pair of cargo shorts and presented them readily to the camera, its rightmost pants leg noticeably torn and, again, scorched. The pants soon found themselves carelessly cast aside, falling onto the floor. Another piece of clothing was hauled off the table and into view, another shirt this time, with a very noticeable, vaguely star-shaped hole right over the stomach of the fabric. Again, the edges of the hole seemed as though they were singed. "See, my mother was something of a worrywart," he explained, continuously showing off more damaged clothing to the camera. Like any parent, she absolutely abhorred the idea of her child being hurt. Obviously, that sort of stuff happens to any kid, that's just life after all. But all this never came about from regular old roughhousing. This, he gestured to the various empty burn creams scattered across the table and his destroyed clothing as bullying in the 24th century. Give a child a stick, they'll smack someone with it. Give them a rock, they'll throw it at someone. Izuku stood up from his chair and placed his leg on the table, rolling up his left pants leg up to his thigh and pointing at what appeared to be an old, faded burn scar. Give a kid the ability to generate explosions from the palm of his hand, he rhetorically asked, tilting his head at the camera and looking directly into the lens. Go blow someone up. His pants leg was unrolled, and the teen smoothed the fabric back down before taking his seat once more, grabbing another pair of pants and digging around in their pockets. I got hurt. A lot, he explained, gesturing dismissively with his free hand. Hazards of being born quirkless. Had to hide all this so my mother wouldn't find out. None of my teachers cared. But whenever Mom found out I'd gotten hurt, she'd call up the school and, yell at him. The school never cared, though. They said some bullshit about how it'd never happen again and that they'd take care of it. They never did. No one ever did. Izuku frowned as he yanked out a handful of bandage wrappers from his pockets, as well as what looked like old faded receipts. Grabbing one, Midoriya brought it close to his face and attempted to decipher its contents. He gave up after exactly 2 seconds. Yeah, I can't read that, he proclaimed, tossing the faded paper over his shoulder. Time washed all the ink away. The teen looked around at all the junk cluttering his table now and sighed, seemingly disappointed. Honestly, I'd show you more of my scars, but aside from that starburst scar you just saw on my leg, the handprint seared into my freaking ankle and half a burn on my hip, he stated, pointing to his left side. There's not much original damage to show. With a roll of his eyes, Izuku went back to sorting through the piles of clothing and trash he'd dumped onto the table, seemingly searching for something specific. After a few moments of silent shuffling, the teen decided to provide a running commentary as he continued. See, I was kidnapped a while back. Yes, that was something that actually happened. I didn't just run away from home, and the guy I was stuck with had the most amazing quirk I'd ever seen. He could manipulate the molecules of anything he touched with his hands and rearrange them into anything he wanted. Anything? Do you have any idea how powerful an ability that is? He questioned, momentarily pausing his search to clamp his hands to the sides of his head, frustratedly pulling on his viridian curls. When he activated his quirk, he sped up too. His hands would move at unbelievable speeds, near subsonic, really. If he touched All Might with his pinky finger, he could kill the guy in an instant. No exaggeration, Midoriya explained, slumping down further into his chair. Wanna know what he did with this power? Blew people up to collect blood samples and bits of their internal organs. Midoriya grabbed the hem of his jumpsuit and lifted it up, showcasing his horrifically mangled torso. The skinny teen's ribs were visible, and there wasn't much of a gut on him either, though he wasn't quite malnourished. Certainly, he was unhealthily thin, but it wasn't horrendous. The only thing of note besides that, though, was how scarred his skin was. The teen's untanned flesh had dozens of long, white scars that looked to be either caused by a whip or knives, raking across his flesh and crisscrossing with no apparent order. There were several burns, but unlike the starburst-shaped ones the teen previously showed off, these were obviously caused by someone heating up a piece of metal and pressing it against his skin. As the outline of what looked like a length pipe, the letter O, and what might have been the imprint of a shovel head was seared into his chest. After holding up his jumpsuit for another moment, the teen let it fall back down and shook his head, continuing to shuffle through the pile of stuff on his table. "Damn it," he cursed, lightly smacking his hand upon the table in frustration. "Can't find him." With another roll of his eyes, the teen addressed the camera once more. "See, the guy I was held captive by would torture you with his quirk by ripping you apart and then piecing you back together. It may have been fast for him, but if you were on the receiving end of it, you got to feel your molecules being slowly ripped apart piece by piece. Honestly, it wasn't too bad until he started touching your nervous system. That hurt. Still, it's torture for a reason. You're supposed to live through it." Once he was done, he'd take your molecules and put them right back where they were supposed to go, or at least, close enough that it didn't matter. Scars have a particular shape, too. Reassembling scars, though, is a legitimate waste of time. Thus, when he pieced me back together, I simply got a brand new, unscarred torso out of the ordeal, since that was easier than putting me back the way he found me. Izuku reached into one of his many pockets and pulled out a tiny green party popper, taking a moment to tug the string and flinching slightly when the device let out a tiny pop and confetti spewed out of it. I've actually got a video of me getting torn apart, but I'm not gonna show that here. The internet's pretty lax about villain manifestos, really. But if I showed off gore, it'd probably get taken down. Whatever, he mumbled, almost as an afterthought. The cops who raid my base will find it. They can shove that deep in their private servers somewhere. Slumping over his desk, the greenette dismissively waved his hand and looked away from the camera. His final words were barely above a murmur. "Whatever. No one cared before, no one'll care now. Why the hell do I even make these?" End video log 4. Okay, sadly the chapter is over. And if you enjoyed the video, just leave a like and subscribe with post notification, so when the next chapter is ready, you will be notified. Okay, see you in the next video. Bye.